Hello guys, thanks for listening in. I'd like to quickly mention a couple things before we get started. Firstly, I'd like to thank the author Knie for giving us the privilege and permission to use this story. Secondly, I will just mention this story has a warning for graphic violence and profanity. If that's not your cup of tea, then please don't continue to listen. For those of you who are still here, please sit back, relax and listen to Necromancer of Valor. Chapter 1: The Arrival. The afternoon was slightly too warm for the liking of a curious pair of individuals traveling along a well-used road towards their goal. Leading the way was Gilbert, a massive bear of a man well in his 40s, covered in an assortment of gear and armor. He towered over regular folk by a foot or two. Though initially a bit threatening, his kind demeanor and premature graying usually reminded people of their grandfathers, and that made him easy to be around. His companion couldn't be more different, as Anastasia was barely the size of one of his legs. Short, lean to a point of malnutrition and impossibly pale, gave her a slightly ghastly appearance with the help of her long white hair. We're almost at the northern wall. There's a lovely inn there, that's basically my home these days. All the adventurers there are good people. Though some might be a bit weird, but you need to be a bit weird to make it in here. Gilbert explained and pointed towards a massive gray city wall in the distance. For kilometers around the walls, the area had been cleared of anything larger than a small bush, and you could see all the way to the horizon, unhindered by trees or hills. The walls themselves continued just as far in both directions, and made for a stunning sight. Beyond those walls was the gigantic city called Valor. Though calling it a city was technically not entirely correct, as it was a sovereign nation as well. The uniqueness of Valor didn't end there either, as the vast majority of its citizens were adventurers by trade, and the rest either provided services for the adventurers or worked for the city itself. If anyone, of any creed or race, ever felt like they didn't belong or simply needed to disappear, Valor would gladly allow them to join the ranks of adventurers, without asking so much as their real name. All one needed to do was to abide by the laws of Valor and the guild controlling it, and earn their keep by completing quests for the guild. In return for organizing everything and keeping the bounty boards full of new quests, the guild simply took a small cut from every reward one of their adventurers received by completing a quest. Gilbert himself had been an adventurer for ages, but the young girl following him was arriving to the city for the very first time, and planned to become an adventurer. Can't be worse than Morn Valley anyway, Anastasia said, and picked up a flower that was grown by the side of the road. She frowned slightly before sniffing it and immediately gagged. Ugh, gross, there's a ton of corpses under these fields. Even the flowers here smell horrible. Really? Gilbert took the flower from her and sniffed it a couple of times, but didn't notice anything odd. Seems fine to me, though you are right about the corpses. It's a small country with a single walled city, so around the time the adventurers seized it, there were a few nations stupid enough to think it would be a good idea to attack a city full of adventurers. He explained. They cleared the corpses from around the walls though, so you won't even notice it from inside. Besides, there's always fresh snacks on sale right past the gates, and their scent covers just about anything. Good, I'm so tired of this smell. Anastasia sighed and covered her nose. The closer to the city they got, more people they came across on the road. Most of them Anastasia had only seen in books, and she managed to make a few of them uncomfortable by staring for too long. Not only was it exciting to see elves, dwarves, beast folk and a few rare races for the first time, seeing them all in a single place was mind-blowing to her. Eventually Gilbert got tired of stopping for every passerby and hurried the girl along until they made it to the gates. Standing by the gates were a few guards that briefly stopped everyone trying to enter the city, seemingly just to greet them. No bags were checked or reasons for entering asked. Eventually one of the guards noticed Gilbert and waved him and Anastasia over. Gilbert, where's the rest of your party? I highly doubt that they stayed behind to enjoy the sights, he asked, and looked a bit worried. Gilbert sighed and shook his head. He had parted from Morn Valley with 3 relatively green adventurers he had just met, but things had gone south during the quest, and he was now the sole survivor of the group. I see, I'll mark them down and have their names added to the walls. If you don't mind me saying, they had it coming. All talk and no show, you know the type. Glad you're back though. Rosie would be devastated if something happened to you, and if something happens to her, it happens to everyone living by the north gate. The guard said, lazily leaning on his halberd. It was customary that the names of adventurers that fell during a quest would be engraved onto the walls of the city. Usually there was no way to recover the body, and there was no room for a graveyard, so the wall was used as a massive cenotaph for them. Lining the foot of the wall under the names was a thick coating of candle wax from the candles left by friends, lovers, and family members of the deceased. Anastasia lost track of time while going through all the different names from different cultures around the world. "And who is this?" the guard asked and gently tapped Anastasia's shoulder with the blunt end of his polearm. Anna as Gilbert started to explain but was interrupted by the girl. "The name's Anastasia Mornvalley, like the country. I'm here to join the guild and form a party with Algebra here." She introduced herself and did a quick curtsy. The guard rubbed his chin. "Mornvalley, you say? So you're a necromancer then?" "Alrighty, no necromancy within the walls. If you have thralls with you, they have to wait outside, further away the better. Can't risk them spreading some disease inside. That applies to gear and ornaments made from corpses too. If a guardsman like me thinks you're too covered in corpse parts, you'll be issued a mandatory bath ticket. I know how you necromancers like to get out there." He listed the rules specific to necromancers while counting with his fingers to make sure he remembered all of them. "Now wait a sec." Gilbert started protesting what seemed like unfair treatment to him, but was interrupted by Anastasia again. "I know. It's disgusting. Back home everyone reeked like they were undead themselves. You don't have to worry about me dragging anything like that with me," she said cheerily. The guard was pleasantly surprised by how readily she accepted the limitations. "Where'd you find her, Gil? I like her already," he asked and turned back to the necromancer herself. "Anyway, don't worry about the tickets too much. On some hot days I wish I was one of you corpse risers too. The bathhouse is amazing, but it costs quite a bit with my pay. Not that we've issued any tickets for years. Your kind isn't exactly a common sight nowadays," the guard said and quickly grabbed something from a satchel he was carrying and handed Anastasia a paper that appeared to be a contract and a grape-sized glass ball. "Here's your paperwork and adventurer's pearl. I trust Gil and Rosie will help you fill them. Once you're registered, you can use the pearl to prove your identity while accepting quests and so forth. Welcome to Valor, kid." To not keep the guard busy for too long, Gilbert suggested they head through the gate. "Keep her alive, Algebra," the guard hollered after them, and laughed with the other guards and adventurers by the gate. Chapter 2. "If that nickname doesn't die off within a week, I'll take you back where I found you," Gilbert mumbled under his breath. "Let's just go to the inn I told you about. The owner, Rosie, can be a bit intense at times, but she's not the type to turn people away, so she can probably offer a room for you, even though you don't have any money." The first thing Anastasia noticed once she entered the city was the oppressive yet pleasant scent of all the food stalls set up all over the market area that opened up straight after the gates. Loosely arranged into a grid around a fountain in the middle of the market, the stands offered a somewhat random assortment of items, ranging from baked goods to trinkets to alchemical potions. The buildings around the market housed even more services that an adventurer would find useful, like a blacksmith and tailor. Every stand they passed seemed to have something that caught Anastasia's eye, something she had never seen before. They spent almost an hour going through the selection, without any intent of actually buying anything. The stalls around here would usually buy pretty much anything valuable looking you might find out there, but keep in mind that everyone else is bringing them in too, so don't expect any mind-blowing offers. Still, it's good to know what everything is worth out there, so you won't get outright scammed, Gilbert advised the necromancer as she tried on a few hats she had spotted. "The snacks are freshly made and taste amazing too, but for a proper meal, you should speak to Rosie." Anastasia placed the hats back where she had taken them from after getting a glare from the merchant, and moved on to the next stall. "Is this Rosie like your wife or something? You never told me you were married," she asked. "Nay, nothing like that. I'm not the type to settle down, but she's a dear friend of mine, and people tend to group us together because we sort of keep an eye on things that aren't really the guild's business. Like making sure you get started on your new life here." Gilbert laughed. "That just sounds like you tried but weren't man enough to climb that mountain." Anastasia giggled. Gilbert groaned and grabbed her hand, so that they would finally get through the market, as they were only halfway though. By the edge of the market, there was a large four-story building that clashed slightly with the architecture of the walls and some other buildings around it. It was obviously built well after the rest of the city, probably by the adventurers themselves, instead of the original builders of valor, whoever they were. Above the door was a crudely painted sign that said the inn, but under it was a second, far ruder name that had been covered with as little effort as possible and was still visible. Did Rosie change the inn's name? Anastasia asked and pointed at the sign. The guild said that the original name she gave it wasn't suitable for the area, since there are a few kids around. Gilbert laughed. Rosie is, well, a character. Amazing, the necromancer said, not entirely sure about the company she was about to start living with. Even through the door, they could hear people laughing and generally being merry. It was something Anastasia hadn't heard often where she was from, but it did make her less nervous to open the door. When she finally mustered up the courage to do so, the most delicious scent she had ever smelled washed over Anastasia. The snack stalls had been good, but the scent inside the inn was enough to make her speechless, so much so that Gilbert had to push her through the doorway. Inside, there were 10 tables scattered around the tavern floor of the inn, and around them were adventurers from all over the world, drinking, eating, playing cards and so on. A few of them turned to see who had entered the inn, but returned to whatever they had been doing after Gilbert greeted them. Though many of the adventurers were curious sights to say the least, the most eye-catching of the inn's inhabitants was leaning against the wall behind the counter. A female beast folk, tigress to be exact. Tall enough to dwarf most men of any race and well-built enough to toss them out if need be. Wearing a worn and stained apron that had Rosie clumsily sewn on it, one of the letters was the wrong way around, but Anastasia was sure that no one had dared to point it out. The tigress had been staring at Gilbert with an unpleased frown on her face from the second they had entered the inn. I take it that that's Rosie. She doesn't eat people, does she? The necromancer asked and stared at a wall to avoid making eye contact with the innkeeper. At least not for as long as she's been here. Just be nice to her and she'll help you out. Gilbert whispered. I feel like she'll snap me like a twig if I'm not. Anastasia whispered back and moved her gaze to the ceiling beams, to not seem like a weirdo. I feel bad for joking about your manliness earlier. There's not enough manliness in the world to climb those mountains. She continued and gestured towards her chest. Gilbert started to push the reluctant necromancer towards the counter, while she tried her best to resist, though unsuccessfully as she had only a fraction of the adventurer's mass. The twerps didn't make it. Big fucking surprise. The innkeeper asked and leaned on the counter as they got closer. I tried telling them not to take that quest, and so did you. If anything, they earned whatever they got. It was a complete shit show. They were setting off faster than I was able to pull them off the previous ones. Gilbert sighed, pulled 2 chairs next to the counter and told Anastasia to sit. You just can't help some people. Rosie glanced at the necromancer and grinned unnervingly before taking out 2 bottles of meat from under the counter and handing them to Gilbert and Anastasia. Gilbert shook his head disapprovingly and grabbed Anastasia's bottle before she could touch it. The innkeeper laughed, poured Anastasia some juice and grabbed back the other meat bottle for herself. That's the problem with you, you're too nice to the wrong people. One of these days one of your shitty rookie parties will drag you down with them. You need to learn how to say no, she said while staring at Anastasia the entire time. And what about this one, are you taking in orphans now? Gilbert gestured for Anastasia to introduce herself. I'm Anastasia. The necromancer stuttered, still without making an eye contact with the tigress. Rosie frowned, walked around the counter and pulled Anastasia closer to her. After sniffing the necromancer's hair, she let out a slight excited growl and started to laugh. You kidnapped the corpse riser from her home. This is great. I did not kidnap anyone. She was basically a prisoner and wanted to leave. Besides, she's more than capable enough to become an adventurer. So if anything, I just gave her a chance to decide her own future. Gilbert explained and took a sip of his drink. Unable to get over the fact that the innkeeper had recognized her home country by smell alone, Anastasia started frantically sniffing her own hair and clothes. Do I smell like corpses? I need to get one of those bathhouse tickets, she asked and tried to wriggle away from Rosie's grasp. Rosie laughed. Calm down, kitten. I've just had a previous run-in with your kind, and remember the slight hint of decay in your scent, other than that you smell delicious. She explained and hugged the necromancer tightly. My name is Rosemary, or Rosie, and this is my inn. If anyone here gives you trouble, you come to me, okay? Unlike this useless old fart, I can be mean to people. While being forcefully pressed against the innkeeper's fur, Anastasia noticed that it had a very pleasant spicy aroma. Ah, thank you, ma'am, you smell nice too. She mumbled, unsure how she was supposed to respond. The innkeeper lifted her up and took a better look at the girl. I love this one, can I keep her as a waitress instead? She's far too precious to go out there with you lot. She asked excitedly. Gilbert reached over the counter for a second bottle. Actually, I was going to ask you that. Not permanently, but she doesn't have any money for food or lodging, so if you'd let her work here until I find a suitable quest she could start with, it'd help out a ton, he said. Rosie let Anastasia down, but grabbed the necromancer's thin arms and waved them around a bit, looking slightly worried. I'm not sure how much she'll be able to work with a couple of twigs as arms, but I'll keep an eye on her. She growled and clapped Anastasia's hands together. Gilbert smiled and finished his second drink in a single, long gulp before getting up. Great. I have some errands to run, so Anna, listen to Rosie while I'm gone, he said and walked around the counter to toss the gear he was carrying into a corner for safekeeping. We'll meet here again tomorrow. Anastasia waved after the old adventurer as he left. She wasn't a fan of being left with almost complete strangers as soon as she had arrived into an unfamiliar city, but was able to stay calm as no one in the inn seemed too suspicious. Chapter 3. Anastasia sat by the counter in silence, awkwardly swinging her feet while staring at the floor. Every time she looked up, she could see the innkeeper stare at her and grin, revealing her sharp teeth. Anastasia had trouble telling whether Rosie was trying to seem friendly or intentionally scary by doing it. After Gilbert had left, it took a while for her to realize that everyone in the inn was looking at her, either by taking a glimpse every now and then or straight up staring, and it didn't make her more comfortable in the slightest. She had been traveling with Gilbert for a few days and trusted him to a degree, but everyone she was with now, even Rosie, was a complete stranger. Rosie noticed the girl's worried look and decided to do something about it. Suddenly she grabbed Anastasia once more and placed her on the counter before roaring to gather everyone's attention. This made the entire tavern quiet in a heartbeat. Whether it was from fear or respect remained unclear. All right, folks, listen up. This lovely young lady here is your new waitress. The rules that apply to me go double for her. That means no touching. If I hear her scream because someone got pushy, I will use that hand to break the rest of that idiot's body. Are we clear? She declared with a thundering voice that probably carried all the way outside. Though it did make Anastasia feel slightly better, it only made the entire tavern stare at her even harder. She didn't like the implications from having to hold the speech in the first place either. The tigress picked her up again and stared at the necromancer judgingly. After a bit of frowning and muttering, Rosie moved her around a bit, as if weighing the girl before placing her back down. You're all skin and bones. Have you ever eaten anything? I know Gil can cook worth shit, so it probably didn't get any better on the way here, she asked and leaned on the counter. Mostly bread and potatoes. One time he caught a deer, but it got burnt on the campfire. Anastasia described the very basic menu the old adventurer was able to offer on the road. Rosie sighed and tightened her apron. That man is an idiot. I would hope you're not done growing, and you need proper food to grow. Let me show you how it's done. Name a course, any of them, she boasted. I've heard fishes are edible. Can you cook those? Anastasia asked. She had never seen a fish, nor was she aware that there were several kinds. The innkeeper stared at the necromancer in disbelief. Fish? You're asking whether a cat can cook fish? Kitten, I'll fix up some salmon that'll make you forget everything you've eaten so far. She laughed and headed into the kitchen but popped back out briefly. It'll only take a minute. Feel free to mingle with the folks here. Most of them live here, so you should get used to seeing them. Anastasia got slightly excited by the prospect of a meal so delicious that she'd forget every other meal she had eaten. Not that she had much to forget, as the typical necromancer's diet consisted almost entirely of roots, herbs and nuts. The higher classes, like Anastasia's family, were occasionally offered meat of uncertain origin, though she herself was never allowed such luxuries. Though they were able to survive, the lack of proper food was likely the cause of the near-skeletal look and relatively stunted growth of many necromancers, including Anastasia. As soon as the watchful eye of the owner was occupied with something else, 3 adventurers stood up from their table and headed towards Anastasia. Led by an older male dwarf, with a sizable gray beard and a pipe in his mouth, followed by a female spriggan and a beautiful elf whose gender was unclear at best, they surrounded the necromancer and began sizing her up with their eyes. The dwarf puffed his pipe a few times. I must say, the quality of new folks coming in. Apparently we're now grabbing malnourished teens to fill the ranks. Not sure what has gotten to Gil, but there has to be something special about her. He commented on Anastasia's less than robust build. The spriggan was quick to defend her. Damn her, you're being rude. She's frail and pale like a porcelain doll, and carries a mighty spirit. She must be a princess of some kind. Bet she got bored of the royal nonsense, and escaped with Gil to chase a more interesting way of life. The nature spirit theorized and put her wooden arm over Anastasia's shoulder. Anastasia had never seen a spriggan before, not even in books, but could guess the overly friendly adventurer's species, because there was nothing else like that in existence. Basically, a mass of moving wood and other plant matter, with a very slight greenish-yellow glow, not that much unlike a swarm of fireflies. The dwarf poked his friend with his pipe. Is it wrong to expect some level of prior expertise and physical suitability for the job? We're not knitting lace here, he asked. Seriously. Go hug a hill giant, plenty of physical suitability for the job for you there. The spriggan scoffed, but after a few seconds of silence, both of them burst out in laughter, while Anastasia just smiled uncomfortably. The dwarf patted Anastasia on the shoulder. Don't mind us, this is just an ongoing debate you got dragged into. If Gil brought you here, there must be something to it, so we're glad to have you. Welcome to Valor, Squirt, he said and smiled. Feel free to come and find me if you want to hear how the hill giant thing worked out. As the dwarf returned to his drink, the spriggan moved her hand to Anastasia's arm and tightened her grip before turning to the third member of the group. What about you, Maximilian? Yay or nay to the new waitress? She asked. The elf had looked puzzled since they had arrived to greet Anastasia. He was exactly like the elves in the books Anastasia had read back in Morn Valley. Tall, slender, with long straight black hair and pointy ears, and fair-looking regardless of gender. She does have a peculiar look to her, not at all uninteresting either. Tell me, fair thing, where do you hail from? He asked politely. I am from Morn Valley. Anastasia stuttered. The elf's eyes lit up in realization. Ah yes. I see it now, the land of the dead. You certainly look the part. It is rare to see your kind here, or anywhere really. Perhaps Valor simply is not gloomy enough. He pondered. Yeah, this isn't anything like back there. Not that it's a bad thing, Anastasia said. The elf chuckled. Splendid. I am Maximilian, or Max if you prefer. The nature spirit who seems so smitten with you carries the name Zamiliere, and the leader of our merry little party is called Dammer. He introduced the adventurers. We are all friends of Gilbert, so by all means, come chat with us when you have the chance. Zamiliere looked victorious and pointed at Dammer. Hear that oldie 2-1 for the new girl. She celebrated. Branches off the waitress, Zamiliere. Rosie interrupted her when she came back from the kitchen with a plate. The spriggan hid behind Anastasia. But I was defending her, she objected. Rosie placed the plate in front of the necromancer, who immediately became distracted by the food. You're going to need to defend your face if you don't let go of her. The tigress growled. The nature spirit yelped, slid something into Anastasia's pocket and scurried back to her table. Sorry about the twig. She's a bit too friendly, but not really dangerous or anything. Just tell her to stop if it really bothers you. The innkeeper sighed and refilled Anastasia's cup with juice. Now then, eat up before you drool on your dress. The necromancer thanked her for the food and began to inspect it while Rosie returned to the kitchen. Anastasia had never seen fish meat, nor smelled it. Initially the strong scent put her off slightly, which was weird considering she grew up around corpses, but it didn't take long for it to grow on her. Next to the pink piece of salmon was a yellowish paste she recognized as potatoes, though they had to be mixed in with something as they tasted far more creamy than usual. On the other side of the salmon was a slice of something yellow she hadn't seen before. "What are you?" she asked and poked the mystery garnish with her fork until it started to leak on the plate. "Oh, this must be a fruit. I didn't know they go well with fish, or anything really," she muttered and tossed the entire slice in her mouth. After chewing it for a bit, she spit it back on the plate and chugged down her entire cup of juice, to was away the bitter taste. "Why would that be on the plate?" she exclaimed and moved the chewed-up lump of lemon away from the rest of the meal. Then it was time for the main piece of the dish. The generously sized pink piece of salmon. The first thing she was confused by were the small black grounds sprinkled on top of the meat. Seasoning was not a thing in Morn Valley, so she just assumed that they were something burnt that had stuck on the meat from the pan. After carefully scraping off the black crumbs, Anastasia tried licking the surface of the piece. "Salty," she stated and started mashing the meat with her fork, until it was in small enough pieces she could mix into the remaining potato mash. Though she had unintentionally done almost everything in her power to ruin the dish, the first bite of the potato salmon mash contained more taste than everything she had eaten in Morn Valley combined. It was everything she had hoped for and more. It was there, and then Anastasia knew that she had chosen correctly by following Gilbert. Before she even noticed, the plate was already empty, and she was seriously considering licking it clean as soon as no one was looking. While looking for a napkin from her pocket, Anastasia's hand came across something that hadn't been there before. She pulled out a little pouch with a folded piece of paper and coins in it. Totaling up to 150 gold, the 3 coins were the first piece of currency Anastasia had ever owned. The note itself simply had roommate written on it and a small heart drawn over it. Anastasia glanced at the Spriggan, who winked at her from across the room. "You're not allowed to go," Rosie stated bluntly when she stepped back out of the kitchen. "She tries that almost every time someone new comes in, just to try and rile me up. Doubt it means anything." Anastasia handed her the coins. "Is this a lot of money? If it is, I need to return it," she asked worryingly. "Yes and no. Out there, it can be a few days' worth of salary for most jobs, but here the values of things are a bit mixed up, and that much won't get you far. It'd get you a room here for a few days, but only because the guild asks me to keep the prices low. Otherwise these guys will just camp outside the city and hunt every animal within miles, like they do well on quests. In return the guild pays me a bonus based on my sales, so that I can continue running this place," Rosie explained and put the coins back in Anastasia's hand. "I wouldn't worry about returning it, she really doesn't need encouragement." She smirked and picked up the chewed piece of lemon from Anastasia's plate. "How was the food?" The necromancer's face lit up. "It was amazing. There were a couple of weird things I didn't really understand, but it had no idea food could be tasty like that," she said excitedly. "It must have been something people eat at fancy parties and such." "Oh, poor kitten, that's what people eat when they buy fish from the market or catch some," she revealed and hugged Anastasia out of pity. "We really need to make sure you get some meat around those bones, but now, how about a tour around the rest of the inn? Follow me," she said, picked up Anastasia's plate and headed into the kitchen with the necromancer. The inn's kitchen was a surprisingly large room behind the counter. Its walls were filled with hanging cooking utensils and ingredients. In one end of the room, there was a large stove with enough space for at least 4 large pots, and a few frying pans. Next to it was a massive wash basin full of dirty dishes, and the rest of the room was filled with as much countertop space as possible for working on multiple courses at once, along with a couple of tables in the middle. "This is where I'll be for most of the day, while you work the front. Though your job starts with helping me with preparing the breakfast before everyone else wakes up. After that you'll take the plates to people and bring empty ones back here. Then we'll start preparing for the lunch and dinner. Once the ingredients are prepared, you'll just take the orders from people and socialize," Rosie explained and started to wipe one of the counters out of habit. "That's a lot of work. Are you sure I'm cut out for this?" Anastasia asked and carefully picked up a knife from a holder on one of the tables. Rosie laughed. "Don't stress over it, keep in mind that I've been doing this alone for years. So even if you can't do much, it still makes it easier for me." She pointed out and took the knife from Anastasia, after noticing that the necromancer was not used to holding one. Your shift starts a bit before sunrise and ends whenever the night waitress arrives. There's another waitress. Anastasia kept inquiring. Yup, Holly, a lovely girl but dumb as a boot. She's the type to be awake at night and can handle the night crowd, so it's nice to have her around. The innkeeper said and cleaned the knife with her apron before placing it back on the table. So that's the gist of it. Let's go upstairs to see your room. Next to the entrance to the kitchen was a staircase that led up to the second floor of the inn, where Rosie led Anastasia to the first door that had the number 1 engraved in it. Along the corridor that continued all the way to the end of the building were other numbered doors like it. This is my room. If you have any troubles and I'm not in the kitchen, this is where you'll most likely find me. Down the hall from here are the baths and restrooms. The baths are free to use and have the things you need for doing laundry. There are 2 more baths on the 3rd floor that are used by the tenants there in the floor above, so these are pretty much just for the folk living on this floor. It's nice if you like your privacy. Rosie explained and started going through a keyring that was hanging from her belt. Once she found the key she was looking for, she took it off the ring and handed it to Anastasia. Here's your key, you're in room 2. I usually keep it vacant because adventurers can be allowed at night, but you seem like the quiet kind. Remember to lock your door at night. No one here would intentionally barge in your room, but they're often drunk, and it has happened before. Anastasia walked over to the door that had the number 2 engraved on it, and fit her key into the lock. Since the lock had been unused for long, it took a bit of force to turn the key. As the door creaked open, Anastasia saw what was going to be her room for the next few years, at least. It was almost directly above the entrance to the tavern, and the room's window showed the market square in its entirety. The window also lit up the entire room nicely, as there were no other buildings blocking the sunlight, as long as the sun had risen above the city walls. Below the window was a small table with a drawer, a starlight crystal lantern on it, and a chair pulled up next to it. In the corner of the room, there was a wardrobe with a mirror attached to its door, and in the other corner, a bed. All in all, it was a rather small room, but Anastasia was a small necromancer, so that wouldn't cause too much trouble for her. Rosie entered the room and wiped some dust off the table. It's nothing grand, but I hope you can cope with it. I have no idea what your old room was like, but this probably doesn't hold a candle to it. She shrugged. No, this is way better. There's even a window. Anastasia exclaimed and put her backpack on the bed. Though the bed was nothing special, she had never seen such a soft one, and couldn't help but to lie down on it. Well, I'm glad you like it. I'll head back downstairs. The night waitress will turn up any minute now, so you can just go take a bath and get some sleep. The towels and so on are in the wardrobe. Rosie said and gave Anastasia a pat on the head before leaving. Anastasia closed the door and started unpacking. She and Gilbert had left in a hurry, so she had only taken whatever was within arm's reach in her old room. Some clothes, most of which needed to be washed by now, a few sheets of paper and some ink, a necklace, a small rusty dagger and a hairbrush. She really needed to get some more money quickly and buy more clothes and other essentials. After arranging them into the wardrobe, she grabbed a towel and headed for the baths. A quick bath had done wonders to the travel-weary necromancer. Before the trip from Morn Valley to Valor, she had never really gone anywhere on foot, and it had taken less than a day for her to tire to a point where Gilbert had to carry her, so that they could keep going. Sleeping out in the woods had turned out to be a bit of a challenge as well. Even though she had gotten used to sleeping on a hard bed, her bed had never been full of rocks and roots that messed up her posture during the night. While laying down in her new bed, she wondered about the people she had met during the day, and was a bit disappointed that she wasn't able to have a proper talk with any of them, as there were still so many things she didn't know about Valor and its people. While going through the events of the day in her head and thinking how different Valor was to Morn Valley, Anastasia slowly started to nod off. Suddenly a knock on the door woke her back up. "Shit, were you already asleep?" Rosie asked and poked her head into the room. Anastasia sat up on her bed. "Yeah, kinda, but don't worry about it." "What's up?" she asked and rubbed her eyes. "I thought you might have had some trouble falling asleep, and was wondering if you'd like to talk a bit, now that I'm done for the day too." The innkeeper explained. "I can go if you're tired though." "Nah, it's fine, I could talk for a bit." The necromancer yawned. Rosie sat down on the floor and leaned against the bed. Her hair and fur were still drenched after taking a bath as well, and she desperately tried to dry them with a towel that was already soaking wet. To Anastasia, it made the tigress considerably less scary to see her like that. "Mine is almost dry, do you want to use it?" Anastasia offered her towel to her. Rosie hastily grabbed it and continued drying herself. "Thanks, kitten. I hate this fur. Sure, it's nice and warm during winter, but it takes forever to wash, dry, and everything I own is covered in it. Sometimes I wonder if I should be working in a kitchen at all." While Rosie prattled on about the negative sides of having fur, Anastasia noticed her tail. It was built like a mace and made a thumping sound every time it hit the floor. After it had been dried with a towel, however, it looked amazingly fluffy, and Anastasia had to fight back the urge to touch it. "So, what brings a necromancer to the City of Valor? Give me the whole story," Rosie asked suddenly. Anastasia groaned. Being born into an insane cult of necromancers that worships a skeleton, and then being voted to be the next anchor. "Oh, that's a lot simpler than I thought it would be," the tigress said and sounded a bit disappointed. "What's an anchor then?" "Anchor is basically just a nobody that's given the responsibility to keep the immortal king reanimated while being literally chained to the throne. Technically anyone could be the anchor, but usually it's reserved for the strongest necromancer in Morn Valley," Anastasia explained. "That does sound rough," Rosie laughed. "But what's this about being the strongest necromancer? You look like a skeleton yourself, and how old are you anyway? How can you be the most powerful one there is when a slight breeze would tip you over?" "I'm 15, damn it. Anyway, age and size has nothing to do with it. Necromancy is a curse you're born with. You can train to get better at using what you have and make up for some difference against someone stronger than you, but the level you're at is more or less set in stone," Anastasia continued explaining. "There are a few others that could beat me because they've been training for years, and I kind of refuse to do anything, but my limits are supposedly above theirs." Rosie laughed. "Should I hire you as a bodyguard instead?" "I don't think that'd work out too well. I pretty much just throw up and pass out if I see blood," the necromancer admitted. "The strongest necromancer there is can't look at blood, that's just great." Rosie laughed while her tail excitedly thumped against the floor. "But yeah, then Gilbert popped up and I ran off with him. But what about you? You really don't seem like the kind that runs an inn as their first career choice." Anastasia changed the subject. "I honestly thought you might eat me earlier." Rosie calmed down and sighed longingly. "Yeah, I guess I still have some rough edges left on me, but the Rosie you see downstairs is almost an act at this point. You see, I used to be a pirate a bit over 6 years ago, then Gil was told to catch me, which he technically did, though that quest was never completed." Anastasia seemed surprised. "He is a big guy, but did he actually beat you?" "What, are you kidding me? It wasn't even close. He did manage to sink my ship though, and without a ship, I wasn't much of a pirate, so now I do this instead," the innkeeper recounted. "I've more or less calmed down over the years, so it's not like I'm planning on going back to my old ways. Though having a ship again wouldn't hurt." "That's extremely cool." Anastasia nodded. "So did you two date or something at some point?" "You kind of seem like you did," and Gilbert just deflected the whole suggestion with some lame excuse. "Fuck no. He's just a dear friend and I obviously care for him, but no, that hasn't and won't happen." Rosie quickly refuted the idea. "Though it's good for the business to have the folks at the North Gate rely on us as sort of a mom and dad of the area." They kept chatting about life in Valor, and the few adventurers Anastasia had already met, until Rosie noticed that the necromancer had nodded off at some point, while she was explaining how some of the things around the inn had to be done once she started working, and some of the things Anastasia would probably run into while serving food and taking orders. The innkeeper quietly dimmed the lamp on the table and snuck out of the room after making sure the girl was tucked in. Chapter 4. Anastasia woke up to a knock on the door of her new room. "Kitten, time to get up. Go wash your face and meet me in the kitchen," Rosie half whispered from the other side and waited for Anastasia to mumble something back before leaving. After slowly becoming a bit less disoriented by the unfamiliar room she woke up in, Anastasia started to remember arriving to Valor, and how she ended up where she was. She looked around the dark room until her eyes were caught by a slight glare of light outside of the window. Slowly, she got up and stumbled over to see what it was, and to let some fresh air in. The glare turned out to be from a guard's lantern that dangled from his halberd, while he and his partner patrolled the street in front of the inn. Anastasia could see a few more such lights by the other side of the market and by the gate, as well as inside a couple of the shops nearby, as their owners prepared for a hopefully busy day of business. As Anastasia brushed her hair by the window, she could hear the two guards chat. "Think it'll rain today. Would keep people off the streets." One of them asked and looked at the cloudy night sky above them. "I could go for a day without drunk idiots haggling with merchants." "Nah, we aren't that lucky. It'll be hot like always. I don't mind having to sort out a few commotions every now and then, but they really should let us lighten the armor a bit. I can't remember the last time I actually needed any of it around here," the other one said. "Some punk threw a rock at me about 3 years ago. Wasn't hard or anything. That's just the closest thing I can remember." The first guard laughed. "Oh, is that he? I'll gibber." Gilbert greeted the guard with a rude hand gesture, while exhaustedly lumbering towards the pair. "That is not my nickname and never will be. Stop trying to make it happen," he said and tapped the guard on his helmet. "What's up?" "Doing some patrolling." "What else is there to do? You guys keep everyone so well behaved that it actually makes our jobs pretty boring." The other guard laughed. "Heard you dragged some kid in here. You ought to stop visiting the ladies and settle down already. You're setting a bad example." "I'm not trying to be her father or any kind of role model. She wanted freedom from her old life and I was able to help. She's her own person and will do what she wants now. She just needs a few people to help her along, and I'm happy to do that much," the adventurer explained. "Besides, someone needs to keep the ladies fed too." "Sure thing, Pops." The guards mocked him. "By the way, since you're already here, mind coming along for a second? The cell door is stuck again, and the lad inside was supposed to be freed 3 days ago." Gilbert let out an exhausted grunt. "Fine. Let's go." He was clearly far too kind and easy to pull along for his own good. As Gilbert and the guards disappeared behind a street corner, Anastasia stumbled to her wardrobe and dug out her last set of clean clothes. A light gray dress, a black leather vest, long black socks and a belt with a few pouches. Still barely awake enough to operate, she somehow managed to get dressed and headed downstairs, while trying to keep her eyes open and not fall over on the stairs. In the tavern she was met by a young girl sitting behind the counter. The odd-looking girl had hair made of pure white feathers that continued down her neck and all the way to her wrists, though the feathers on her arms were far longer and made them resemble wings. Wearing a loose-fitting pure white ruana and an apron, she didn't look that much unlike a ghost in the dimly lit tavern. Especially when Anastasia noticed the girl's unusually large eyes that seemed almost entirely black because of the massive pupils covering them, she gave the necromancer the chills. The girl's head tracked Anastasia's movements while her giant, unblinking eyes just kept staring at the necromancer. "Who?" the odd girl finally asked, as Anastasia was about to pass her and go into the kitchen. Anastasia tried her best to avoid direct eye contact. I'm Anastasia, the new waitress." "Are you Holly?" "Yes." The girl answered and kept staring blankly. "And nice to meet you. I'll just go see Rosie now." Anastasia stuttered and stumbled past the counter into the kitchen. Rosie was peering into the firebox of her stove and every now and then blowing air into it. Anastasia kneeled next to her and peeked in as well. The kindling under the few pieces of firewood was smoldering but didn't light up properly. "Any chance you can do a bit of fire magic?" Rosie asked and tried striking her flint a few more times. "I'm not a mage. Necromancy has nothing to do with magic," Anastasia pointed out. "In fact, we're taught to think of magic as inferior, because I don't know, because we're kind of assholes." "Really? I always figured it was magic. Anyway, could you get me that bottle?" Rosie pointed at a glass bottle on one of the tables. Anastasia obliged and picked up the bottle of clear liquid. She swirled it around a bit before popping open the cap and sniffing it. The liquid had a very recognizable stench of strong liquor, which burned the necromancer's nose and made her cough. Rosie took the bottle from her and sprinkled some of its contents into the firebox. After one more strike at the flint, everything in the stove burst into bright blue flames that slowly changed into the normal orange kind, as the kindling and wood caught on fire as well. Sometimes it takes a bit of convincing to start up properly. Usually I avoid this since alcohol this strong is expensive though. She explained and wiped the soot from her hands to her apron. Oh, did you meet Holly? She should be by the counter. Yeah, she seemed nice, I guess. Anastasia shrugged and glanced at the kitchen entrance to make sure Holly wasn't still staring at her. She's something else, ain't she? Birdfolk aren't exactly known for their smarts, but wow. Rosie said and started wiping the tables and counters while talking. What do you want to do? We'll have to dismantle some chickens, chop some onions, carrots and bacon, grind coffee and fill some pots with water. Carrots, the necromancer exclaimed. I mean, I can do the carrots and onions, and maybe the bacon, but no chicken. Raw meat is just a bit too familiar. Alright then, your apron is on the hook over there. The knives are on the table. If you find a dull one, put it aside, and we'll sharpen it when things slow down. The onions and carrots are in the pantry there, about a sack of each should do. The innkeeper instructed her new waitress. After finding the ingredients, it didn't take long for Anastasia to realize that lifting them wasn't an option for her, so instead she dragged them along the floor, while Rosie effortlessly carried a huge pan full of water over to the stove. The tigress watched Anastasia struggle to lift the sacks on the table, and shook her head disapprovingly. You really need to start eating better food, this is just sad to watch, she said and helped the necromancer out. Anastasia started chopping the carrots with precise but slow movements that were far more suited to stripping flesh from bone than anything, but since it didn't look like she'd hurt herself, Rosie stayed out of it, and let the necromancer work in peace while preparing the chickens. They were both focused on the work and didn't even say a word until Holly suddenly walked in. Time to leave, she declared and stared at Rosie without blinking once. Already? Time sure flies while working. Rosie laughed and handed a piece of raw chicken to the girl, who gladly accepted it. Your pay for the night is under the counter, as always. The birdfolk silently walked out of the kitchen and left without saying a word to anyone. There she goes. I have no idea what she does with the money, or if she actually knows what it is, but she keeps coming back, so I assume she needs it for something. Rosie said, turned to Anastasia. But that means it's time for you to man the counter. I can handle things in here on my own. While you wait for folks to wake up and find their way downstairs, maybe take a look at your registration papers. As soon as you fill and take them to the offices, they'll activate the glass pearl you got, and you'll be able to accept quests. Just don't do anything too dangerous. There are far worse opponents there than carrot sacks, so start off by gathering ingredients for alchemists or something, okay? After taking over the counter, Anastasia waited for what seemed like ages before anyone actually came downstairs, so she had ample time to get some breakfast for herself and fiddle with the items hidden under the counter. Once some groggy adventurer finally stumbled down the stairs, Anastasia followed him to the table and actually gave the poor fellow a bit of a scare by speaking up so suddenly. The breakfast was free for anyone who came to the tavern from upstairs, but only for a limited time, so Anastasia only had to ask for money from a few guards that came in to grab something to eat after their shifts, which suited her fine, as she had no idea how much anything cost. Once things had started to slow down again, Gilbert stumbled back into the inn after his nightly adventures and sat down next to the counter. "Mornin', Anna, working hard?" he asked, seemingly exhausted. "Where were you?" Anastasia asked and grinned. The old adventurer sighed and rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "My services were needed elsewhere, the usual damsel in distress type of a deal, you see." He carefully worded his response. "Can I get a cup of coffee and whatever Rosie is making today?" Anastasia's grin widened. "I see, so these damsels aren't the cooking type then. Also, it'll cost you since you didn't come from upstairs." Gilbert sighed. "That's not how it works. The rule is that anyone living here gets the free breakfast. Rosie just said that to you because you don't know the regulars yet," he explained, somewhat glad that the necromancer didn't dig deeper into his affairs. "Look, the instructions from Rosie are very clear. You come down the stairs, you get a free meal. You come in from the outside, you pay for it. Are we going to have a problem here?" Anastasia said and waited for Gilbert to take out his purse before telling Rosie about the order. Slowly, as the adventurers got fed and the sunlight coming in through the windows filled the room, the chatter between them increased. Many who hadn't been in last night were wondering who the new waitress was and had to get filled in by the others. Anastasia had been slightly anxious earlier, but it quickly eased up as more of the guests greeted her, and turned out to be decent folk, though slightly odd at times. Around the time the offer for a free breakfast was ending, and the guests started to return to their rooms or leave for their quests, the inn's door was suddenly kicked open. A man clad in shining silvery armor, decorated with golden engravings from head to toe, waltzed in and very clearly judged the room and the people in it in his head. Following him was a woman who had the hood of her pure white cloak pulled as far down as possible, covering her face almost entirely. They sat down at an empty table in the corner of the inn and placed their gear down. Dammer, who had come up to the counter to ask for his coffee to be delivered by Rosie instead of Anastasia as a joke, leaned in and whispered to the necromancer. A paladin of Sylvia, they act all fancy and bright, but are actually the lowest humanity has to offer. Watch your step, lass. Anastasia nodded and walked over to the corner table nervously. Just as she was about to greet them, the paladin interrupted her. "Does this shithole serve anything fresh?" he asked pompously. Slightly stunned by how much of an ass the man was, Anastasia stuttered. "Yes, everything has been prepared this morning." "That's obviously a lie, but I'll take a ham sandwich and a coffee." "She'll take a bottle of wine and some apple slices, if they aren't rotten," he ordered loudly. "Thank you for the order, it shouldn't take long." Anastasia nodded and scurried away as fast as she could, only to return a couple of minutes later with their order on a tray. "Here you go, sir." She served them with a very obvious fake smile. "Took your time, didn't you?" "Dismissed," the paladin said and waved for Anastasia to leave them be. Anastasia hurried back to the counter, forgetting to ask them for the money. The pair ate while reading some books they had brought in with them, and seemed satisfied by the food. After a while, the guests started to forget about the paladin and returned to their conversations. Dammer continued to pester Anastasia about the coffee, long enough for Rosie to come out of the kitchen and tell the dwarf to piss off. But as soon as the paladin noticed the innkeeper, he threw his plate at a wall and stood up. "The cook is a beast. How dare you serve me food made by this subhuman whore?" he yelled and spit on the floor. Rosie herself had no idea what was even going on and was mostly just confused, but Anastasia was already fuming. So far, she had 2 friends in the world, and one of them had just been insulted by a pompous twat she already hated. "I demand you hand over the beast," and the paladin continued, but was interrupted by Anastasia slamming her fists against the counter. Suddenly every piece of chicken bone from the plates around the tavern floated up and split into hundreds of sharp fragments, before shooting towards the paladin. Many of the smaller pieces were stopped by his armor, but the larger ones punctured it like it was wet paper, and threw him against the wall hard enough to crack a few of the boards. When the barrage finally ended, everyone in the inn looked around in confusion. Many of the adventurers had their hands on their weapons, but relaxed once they realized what was going on. Anastasia stomped over to the paladin, gathering the bone fragments around the room into a single mass floating above her hand. "Fucking run," she demanded and stared down at the confused paladin. As a few of the adventurers began to gather around him as well, the paladin realized that he wasn't in a position to argue and quickly fled the scene, quickly grabbing his gear and dragging his partner out by her hand. Anastasia let the remaining bones fall back down. "Am I in trouble?" she asked and looked back at Rosie. Chapter 5. While half of the guests were still trying to piece together what had just happened, Gilbert rushed to Anastasia. "Anna, what were you thinking?" he yelled. The necromancer stared at the ground, ashamed of her outburst. "I don't know. He was being a dick, and I just got so angry, and then there was chicken and am I going to get arrested?" She worried and grabbed Gilbert's hand. The old adventurer rubbed his forehead and sighed. "Maybe. The guild knows that these guys are assholes and won't bother listening to him if he tries to report you, but you can't just attack people because they piss you off." He scolded the necromancer and dragged her to the counter. Rosie had been quiet for the entire time, but couldn't hold her laughter anymore. She had to lean on the counter to not fall over before finally calming down a bit, though only to say a few words. "She almost killed a paladin with chicken," she said, and lost it again. The rest of the tavern began to slowly realize the hilarity of the situation, and the laughter spread among the guests. Gilbert slammed his hand on the counter. "Damn it, Rosie, get it together. The guards will be here any second now," he said, trying to get the innkeeper to take the situation seriously. "I'll go meet them outside. Maybe I can talk them out of taking Anna with them. You take her to the kitchen." Rosie had to take a few deep breaths to calm herself down. She took Anastasia to the back, sat her down, and began to brew some coffee. The necromancer herself had pretty much only registered the words "the guards will be here any second now," and started to weep quietly. She feared that her stay in Valor would get cut short by the incident, and she would get thrown out. Soon enough, 3 guards arrived and met Gilbert outside. He managed to convince them that Anastasia wasn't dangerous, and 2 of the guards decided that they weren't needed for the procedure, and left to continue patrolling the streets. The 3rd guard entered the inn, took his helmet off, and started to take testimonies from the adventurers that had seen what happened. After writing down something, he headed to the kitchen and knocked on the doorframe before entering. "Good day to you, ladies. As you probably guessed, I'm here about the incident that happened a few minutes ago. I'd like to hear your side of the story, as the victim's version seemed more than a bit off to say the least." He explained and put his halberd into the corner of the kitchen, possibly to seem less threatening. Anastasia recognized the guard as the one who had greeted Gilbert and her by the gates when they first arrived at the city. "You're not going to take me to jail or throw me out?" she asked and wiped her tears with her sleeve. The guard looked at the papers in his hands. "I have it on multiple accounts that the paladin had his weapon drawn and attacked you, after you had politely warned him and asked him and his partner to leave. That would make this a pretty clear-cut case of self-defense. Is this true?" he asked, obviously knowing exactly how reliable and biased his witnesses were. Anastasia was confused. "What?" "He didn't," she started, but Rosie silenced her before she could say anything stupid by covering her mouth with a fresh cinnamon roll. The innkeeper then forcibly made the necromancer nod before letting go. The guard laughed. "I see. It appears that there's no need to take you in then. You were obviously acting with your other guests' safety in mind, and had the situation in control." He declared and signed the papers he had. "I would like to thank Miss Tigress for her assistance during this interrogation. I trust there'll be a cold drink here with my name on it when I come back after my shift." He hinted and started to strap his helmet back on. Anastasia had eaten through the pastry and opened her mouth. "I can still become a citizen, right?" she worried. "But of course you can. If anything, this will make you look resourceful. Now, if you excuse me, I have an asshole paladin to fine for frivolous accusations and threats." He laughed, picked up his weapon and exchanged a few words with Gilbert before disappearing back outside. The old adventurer stormed into the kitchen. "Do you have any idea how lucky you are never, and I mean never, pull this shit again?" He scolded Anastasia before huffing and puffing his way upstairs to finally get some sleep. While preparing for the lunch rush, Rosie and Anastasia went over what had happened. The innkeeper still thought it was funny, but warned her against attacking anyone in the city again. Anastasia should just let the adventurers and Rosie handle the difficult customers, not that they were too common. Almost as soon as the situation had normalized, some of the more musically gifted guests came up with a song about the mighty chicken mage of Valor. As the lunch rush was dying down, Anastasia finally had the time to get some meatloaf for herself. Rosie gave her a clearly increased portion compared to the one she had served earlier, but the necromancer didn't mind, since she had never had any before. As she was eating, she remembered the registration form she was supposed to fill whenever she got the chance. The questions were fairly simple and didn't go into too much detail. Name, date of birth, marital status, possible relatives that were already citizens. Rosie pointed out that since there was no real way to check how accurate some of the answers were, she could just come up with a name and age she wanted to have. The tigress herself was registered as 26-year-old, but in reality, was a few years older than that. The guild didn't care about who the new citizens were, or where they were from. All that mattered was that they behaved themselves, and followed the few simple rules the city had about how the adventurers were supposed to conduct themselves during quests. Anastasia was tempted to change her family name, as it reminded her of the country she had escaped from. The Morn Valley line of necromancers were an ancient family, the first ones to settle the land where the royal castle now stood, and so took it upon themselves to call their tribe and the area with the same name. Even to this day, they held a position as one of the higher-ranking royals, making Anastasia effectively a princess of sorts. Yet after a while, when she couldn't come up with a better name, she just left that part of the form blank. While Anastasia was going through her answers one more time, Maximilian came over to the counter and leaned in to whisper. "Say, Anastasia of Morn Valley, you are not an average necromancer, are you? I've had dealings with a few of your kind, including some action, and they were frankly pathetic in comparison. I have always thought of necromancy as slow and rather useless in direct combat, because of all the preparation it takes, but you have made me rethink this. Not only did you only need a second, you were able to use whatever bones were lying around." Anastasia was a bit uncomfortable that someone had realized her potential. She was supposed to avoid causing rumors about a strong necromancer appearing in Valor, just in case someone from Morn Valley wanted to come and get her back. "Then you haven't seen anything. Do the others know?" she asked. Maximilian smiled. "Ah, so that is how you would prefer things. Worry not, your secret is safe with me. I doubt anyone else has figured it out. It is rare to see necromancy in the first place, so I would not be surprised if most people thought of you as a mage," he said and turned away to return to his table. "Oh, and Zamiliere sends her love." Anastasia looked over at the table Maximilian's party was staying at. The Spriggan was already staring at her and blew out a flying kiss as their eyes met briefly. The necromancer quickly looked down at her papers and acted like she didn't notice. As Anastasia finished her meal and took a quick break before starting to collect some of the empty dishes from the tables, Gilbert came back downstairs from his nap. Though it had only been a couple of hours, he didn't want to mess up his sleeping cycle. Well, he had to get Anastasia started on her new life as an adventurer. The nap had also helped with his mood a bit, and after briefly speaking with Rosie, he sat down next to the counter with 2 fresh coffees from the kitchen. "Here, Anna. I'm sorry I yelled at you earlier. It's just that you burned a lot of my favors for the guards with that stunt, but I have to admit, it was pretty funny now that I think about it." He smiled and handed Anastasia one of the drinks. "Rosie tells me you've got your forms filled. We could head over to the offices to submit them now. She said she can handle the serving alone for a while, now that the lunch crowd have been dealt with." Anastasia took the first sip of coffee in her life, and immediately fell in love with the taste. It didn't take long for her to gulp down the entire cup and get a refill from the kitchen, along with a couple of cookies. "This stuff is great," she muttered and emptied the second cupful. Anastasia was still confused about how Rosie managed to run the inn alone and checked on her again, just to be sure that she could leave. After getting the all clear, she folded the forms into her pocket and made sure that she had the pearl with her when they left the inn. The guild office of Northern Valor wasn't that far off from the inn, only about a 5-minute walk along the main road from the market. On the way there, Gilbert made sure to point out any shops that sold gear that might fit Anastasia. She wasn't the only small adventurer in the city, and so getting things like clothes wouldn't require ordering and getting them made specifically to her, but armor would often have to be at the very least adjusted for the wearer, no matter the size. The guild office itself was more like a castle, surrounded by a smaller wall and a moat, and only accessible by a drawbridge. Inside its walls were what seemed like hundreds of adventurers, looking for a party to tag along with, leaving for or returning from a quest, or some other official business that couldn't be done with the guards. The lobby was equally full of people, though forming orderly lines that ended at counters labeled based on the specific service they provided. Luckily, the one that had an application sign over it was free at the time. Behind a large pane of glass was a man wearing a neat purple uniform, slightly similar to the ones guards wore under their armor, though much more fancy, and with the golden crest of the guild sewn on the both shoulders. The most noteworthy thing about the clerk, however, was the red crystalline horn on his forehead. He noticed the necromancer folding out her forms and spoke up. "Young lady, are you here to apply for a citizenship? If so, could I see your paperwork?" he asked politely, though in a weirdly monotone manner. Anastasia handed over the papers through a slot in the glass. The clerk straightened them and began going through the questions. "Thank you. Let's see, Anastasia, 15 years old," he muttered and took a glance at the necromancer. "Could be, I suppose. No relatives in Valor, if I may pry slightly. Have you come here to be an adventurer?" he asked. Anastasia worried that she had filled out something incorrectly. Yes, is there a problem with the answers? No, I was simply curious of your abilities. Clearly you are not a warrior of any kind, but perhaps a major scholar. The clerk asked and placed the forms into a folder next to him. I'm a necromancer, Anastasia admitted. The clerk squinted and took a better look at her. Is that so? That would make you the only one we currently have in our employ. Your kind gathered to Morn Valley ages ago and never returned. I trust the guards have explained the rules specific to necromancers to you, he asked. Anastasia nodded. Very good. All we need now is for you to place the pearl you were given into the stand here. The guild official explained and gestured towards a small stone cylinder on the counter. The necromancer took out the glass ball and slotted it into the small hole on top of the stand. Suddenly the pearl began to glow red, as if it was being heated, and then dimmed down. This repeated 3 times before it began glowing white instead. There we are. Anastasia of Valor, you are now a citizen of our city. Serve it well and it will serve you likewise, the clerk said and bowed grandly. The gentleman behind you can no doubt fill you in on the details of accepting quests, so please remove your pearl from the stand and move away from the counter. They thanked the clerk and moved along to allow the people behind them to submit their forms. Gilbert grabbed Anastasia's hand and pulled her through the crowd to a large board with hundreds of notices on it. Are these quests? Can we pick one? I want to hunt a troll or clear a bandit hideout or something, the necromancer asked excitedly and began going through the notices. These are just the simple ones, for people who are just starting out or don't have a party yet, Gilbert explained. I'm not going to take you anywhere near bandits or trolls before you get some gear, and I get to see what you can do. After a bit of searching, he took one of the notices. This seems fine. Find and hunt down the deer that are trampling my fields. It pays pretty well and is nearby, so how about we give it a shot tomorrow? Anastasia stared at the old adventurer with an expression that could only be described as bored enough to be disgusted. Sure. Fine. Whatever. She sighed and rolled her eyes. Chapter 6. Anastasia hadn't even gotten out of the bed and was already bored by the deer hunting quest. Even though she understood why Gilbert had chosen a quest like that, it still seemed like an enormous waste of time for a necromancer to go out and kill a couple of deer. The 1,500 gold promised for the deed were pretty much the only thing that finally motivated her to get up and start preparing for the trip. It seemed like a lot for a job of that level, but Anastasia figured that the animals had been messing with the farmer for a good while, and he just wanted to get rid of them, no matter the cost. Hair. Check. Clothes. Check. She muttered while getting ready. Such a nice day to go out and murder some innocent animals for money. Rosie had already prepared the breakfast for the day when Anastasia finally managed to drag herself downstairs and to one of the tables. Mornin', kitten. Big day today, huh? She asked and poured a cup of fresh coffee for the necromancer. You know, I was wondering, if you can't stand blood at all, how were you going to hunt the deer? Anastasia's eyes widened and she turned even paler than usual. I didn't think about that. I guess I'll just do it while throwing up, a lot. She had somehow failed to realize that most quests would almost certainly include killing a thing or two. The stupid deer quest had somehow just become even worse. As Anastasia emptied her second cup of coffee, Gilbert came downstairs already geared up and ready to go. He stretched his back and tapped the necromancer on the shoulder cheerfully. How's about we head out right away? It's only about an hour's walk, so we'll probably be back by lunch. Have you got everything you need? Anastasia just let out an annoyed moan and slowly stood up. In exchange for promising to bring back as much venison as they could, Rosie gave both of the adventurers their breakfasts to go and sent them on their way. Anastasia opened up the food parcel as soon as they left the inn, and began shoving the apple slices in her mouth. What's this? She asked with her mouth still full and held up a small sausage. You've never seen a sausage. It's like you're trying to make me feel bad for you, Gilbert asked and opened his parcel as well. While eating, they passed by a small hut right outside the city gates, used by the guards as a storage for their things while on duty. Next to it was a bench, and on that bench slept a woman with bright red curly hair. Surrounded by empty wine bottles, she seemed like a common drunk, but both the cloak she used as a blanket, and her armor under it, were in immaculate condition. Anastasia recognized the woman as the one that had accompanied the asshole paladin she had almost killed the day before. Isn't it, she said, but was interrupted. Yes, it's her. How about we don't bother ourselves with the likes of them and carry on with the quest? Gilbert suggested and pushed Anastasia forwards by the shoulder. Having eaten something, the necromancer started to feel a bit better about the quest, and figured that she just needed to look at it from a different angle. The sun was just rising, and they were on a nice little walk that just happened to end with a bunch of dead deer. That was simply how life sometimes worked out. The air felt nice and fresh too, nothing like the rotten stench she had breathed for years in Morn Valley. Hey Gil, you don't happen to know of a way to kill a deer without any bloodshed, do you? She asked to start up a conversation. The old adventurer scratched his beard. I once wrestled a cow to death, and it didn't bleed externally at least. Yeah, I don't think I can pull that off, unless these deer are squirrel-sized. Anastasia said and showed the approximate size the animals would have to be. Can't you just snap their spines with a bit of necromancy? Gilbert suggested jokingly. I could, if they stayed still long enough. The necromancer shrugged. Living bone and flesh is a lot trickier than dead stuff. In fact, most necromancers simply can't do it at all, which is probably why it's called necromancy, and not like meatmancy or whatever. Suddenly Gilbert looked a bit worried. Hold up for a second there, kid. Necromancers can control living beings. That sounds like something the world should be extremely worried about. He asked. To a degree. There's some low percentage of us that have the gift for it, but the methods they use are still brutish and clumsy, so the flesh and bone tend to come off when they try it. But you shouldn't worry too much. The whole idea behind necromancy is overruling the will of the material, so strong-willed creatures have some ability to at least slow it down. From then on, it's a crapshoot depending on a bunch of things, like whether you're a necromancer or not. Anastasia explained. The one requirement for usable material is that it had to have a will at one point, meaning things like rocks and plants are out, and dead things are usable and easy to overrule, because they once had will but don't anymore. Gilbert seemed satisfied with the explanation. He had never really been interested in necromancers, but adventurers never knew what they would run into next, and understanding at least the basics of things helped when they needed to be dealt with. What about things like Spriggan or Simulacra? Those have wills, so can you control them? He asked. If you're thinking whether I can shut Familiar up or not, I'm afraid that it's a no. Anastasia shook her head. As far as I know, the Spriggan are spirits controlling regular plant material, kind of like us actually. As for Simulacra, I've never seen one, so I wouldn't know. Well, they chatted about necromancy, its uses and possible roles Anastasia could fill in a party when they eventually would find more members. The open fields around Valor slowly changed into a more wooded kind. Eager to branch out from her current ill-fitting vocation, Anastasia wondered if she could use other ranged combat options, such as archery or maybe even magic. After about an hour, they spotted a single house in the distance, surrounded by vast fields of root vegetables, such as potatoes and turnips. Some of the fields clearly had signs of animals trampling the crops and eating the sprouts. In some areas the damage was so bad that it clearly warranted getting rid of the culprits. These are deer tracks all right. Gilbert muttered and inspected some of the hoofprints in the mud. Kind of odd for them to race back and forth from the forest like this though. The tracks continued into the nearby tree line, but there was no visible movement among the trees. Going after them in the woods would work both for and against the adventurers, as their movements would be concealed to a degree by the undergrowth and trees, but getting a direct line of sight to have a chance at hitting the deer with an arrow would also be harder. Let's just go and meet the guy who hired us. Let me handle the talking, okay? Gilbert said and gestured for Anastasia to follow him to the house. As soon as they stepped foot off the road and into the fenced-off yard, an old man barged out of the house with a loaded crossbow in his hands. Gilbert instinctively moved into the line of fire between the man and Anastasia, and readied his wooden shield. The old farmer squinted his eyes and peered at the adventurers for a while before lowering his crossbow. "You're not deer, are you?" he asked and stepped off the porch. "No sir, we are here on behalf of the guild. Apparently you have some troubles with a herd of deer." Gilbert greeted the farmer and bowed. "About damn time. I'd hunt them down myself, but my age has gotten to my side. Almost shot one of the farmhands the other day." The farmer laughed. Hearing that his issue was finally going to be dealt with had immediately gotten him into a better mood. Those pests come out of the woods during nighttime and trample everything I try to grow. I've tried to ambush them, but somehow they always know not to come out when I'm there. All right, we're going to look for them in the forest then. Shouldn't be long since they clearly like this area and wouldn't stray too much. Gilbert explained, grabbed his bow and started warming it up by pulling on the string a few times. Anna, let's get this done before dinner. They headed into the forest from the same spot that the deer seemed to use the most and began following the trail. Though the sun was already up, the treetops blocked off most of the light and made the tracking harder, but not impossible for the seasoned adventurer. After wandering between the trees for a while, they stopped to listen for a bit. Gil, I think I smell rotting flesh. It's not too bad, but there's definitely something dead nearby. Anastasia whispered and covered her nose. Gilbert sniffed the air trying to pick up the scent. Really? I can't smell anything. Are all necromancers bloodhounds as well? He joked. Animals die in the woods all the time, so there might just be a moose carcass somewhere here. Having heard nothing, they continued to follow the tracks deeper into the woods. With every step the smell of rot became stronger and stronger, to a point where even Gilbert started to notice it. Eventually they stopped by a small clearing because the deer tracks had suddenly stopped. There were some older ones here and there, but the animals hadn't been around there in the last few days. The old adventurer stared at the ground around them and scratched his beard. I can't believe I've turned the wrong way at some point. It's been a while since I had to track one, but I shouldn't be this rusty. He murmured quietly. Gil. Anastasia whispered and tugged on the adventurer's sleeve. That's not a deer. She asked and pointed at a huge mass of dark fur by the opposite edge of the clearing. Around the mass were the mangled carcasses of maybe 7 or 8 deer. Gilbert quickly ducked and moved behind a tree. No, it is not. Anastasia mimicked him and hid herself. Now what? Do we run? She asked. Before Gilbert could answer, the slight breeze among the treetops snapped off a dead branch from one of the trees they were hiding behind. It fell down and rustled slightly as it hit the ferns, though actually barely audible. The situation made it feel like the entire tree had just come crashing down. The furry creature had heard it as well, and turned to look at what had caused the noise. It immediately spotted the adventurers and let out an ear-shattering roar, before tossing aside a deer carcass it had been eating and lumbering towards the pair. Yes, we run. Gilbert yelled and waited for Anastasia to bolt off before legging it after her. The necromancer had the advantage of being small enough to effortlessly run among the trees, and be able to make sharp turns. Gilbert was less nimble, but at least a lot smaller than the creature chasing them, so both of them could gain distance from it. First one to come out of the woods was Anastasia. She stumbled on some roots at the end and rolled over a few times, but stuck the landing, and made it seem almost intentional for the old man, who was still waiting on his porch for the adventurers to return. Did you get them already? The farmer asked and got up from his chair. Get inside, now. Anastasia yelled at him and hopped over the fence. The old man looked confused at first, but once Gilbert and the creature chasing him rushed out of the tree line, he gained a surprising amount of spryness and ran inside. The creature seemed hesitant to come more than a few meters away from the shade of the trees, but clearly didn't want to give up on its new prey, and slowly stepped into the sun. Anastasia hadn't seen a creature like it before. Its stance resembled that of a bear, four-legged, but able to cover some distance with just its back legs, and use the front ones to grab things to a degree. The fur covering the entire creature was thick, and almost black, though the creature didn't take good care of it, and some spots appeared greener because they had a thin layer of moss on them. The face of the creature was mostly covered in fur too, and its eyes seemed like 3 shiny black stones amongst it. The mouth of the monster was large enough to fit most of Anastasia's upper body in it, and was lined with sharp, needle-like teeth. The whole package towered at roughly 5 meters when standing on its back legs, no doubt making a lasting impression on anyone facing it. What is this thing? Anastasia asked and prepared to use her craft on the creature. Gilbert stuck closer to the monster and made noise by hitting his shield with his mace, to make sure the necromancer wouldn't be targeted. A forest ogre, big one too. Think your magics work on it? He asked and tossed a stone at the beast to annoy it further. For fuck's sake, I am not a mage. Anastasia yelled before realizing how little it mattered at the moment. But yes, if you can stun it for 10 seconds or so, I can rip off something it needs. Gilbert grasped his mace harder as the ogre stumbled towards him. The first few swipes of its claws were easy enough to avoid, and he was even able to punish the creature for them by hitting it a couple of times. But then the ogre made a sudden move he didn't expect, and he barely caught it with his shield, which immediately broke because most shields weren't designed for hits that big. The claws left a few scrapes on his arms, but that wasn't anything the adventurer couldn't just shrug off. Instead of falling back, Gilbert seized the opportunity to hit the creature in the face, causing it to rear back and start flailing blindly. Anastasia had made some progress earlier, but the flailing undid all of it. "You need to keep it still," she reminded her friend. "You come here and hold it still." Gilbert responded and avoided another blow. The flailing itself didn't cause much problems for a competent fighter such as him, but it did stop him from approaching the ogre. He kept his distance until the creature started to show some signs of fatigue, while also waiting for a more predictable swing he could use to get closer and attack. Meanwhile, the necromancer's efforts didn't amount to much, so she started looking for anything else that might help, while her partner worked on tiring the beast out. None of the farming tools seemed too useful, but the farmer had left his crossbow on the porch. Anastasia ran over to get it and aimed at the rampaging creature, but she had never used such a weapon before, and couldn't figure out how it worked. "How does this thing go twang?" she asked and held the bow up. Gilbert took a quick glance at her. "That's perfect, just toss it to me," Gilbert advised. Anastasia tried throwing the crossbow, but the arc fell horribly short, so she had to go and bring it to Gilbert herself, before running off back to safety. The crossbow wasn't loaded, which would have been an issue for most people in that situation, since reloading it would require stopping for a while and stepping on the stirrup. But Gilbert was not most people. He grabbed the stirrup with one hand, and gave the string a tug with the other, all the while keeping an eye on the ogre and avoiding its wings. After putting the bolt back in its place, he aimed at the ogre's shoulder and hit it. A single bolt wouldn't do much after going through the creature's fur and fat, but it was enough to make the ogre avoid using one of its front legs, making it a lot more predictable. The ogre wailed in pain and swung at the adventurer one more time, far faster than Gilbert had expected. He didn't have time to avoid it and had to brace for the impact. The force of the blow was enough to throw him off the ground. Luckily, he was able to grab onto the ogre's fur, and was instead swung over its shoulder. Seeing his opportunity, he clung onto the beast's neck and started to choke it with his mace. "Now, Anna," he yelled. Anastasia had already realized that the ogre had slowed down, and while rearing back to reach Gilbert, it stayed still enough. She muttered some of the basic teachings of necromancy to herself to hurry up the process. Slowly she could feel the control over the creature's vertebrae shift over to her, and as soon as she could, she twisted them, breaking the ogre's neck. When the ogre stopped struggling, Gilbert dropped off its back and let it collapse forwards. As it hit the ground, the impact on its chest emptied the creature's lungs, and made it throw up a generous amount of blood. The spray carried surprisingly far and covered the celebrating necromancer with a red coating of blood. Before she even had the time to throw up or much less say anything, Anastasia turned pale and passed out on the spot. The old farmer had been following the fight through a window and stepped down now that it was over. He walked over to the ogre and took a look at it. "That's not a deer," he stated and picked up his crossbow from the ground. "Really? What gave it away?" Gilbert joked while catching his breath. "That ate the deer." Both of them walked over to the necromancer, who was laying on the ground, covered in blood and somehow even paler than usual. "Is the lass gonna be alright?" the farmer asked and poked her with his foot. Chapter 7. When Anastasia finally came to, she had been moved to the porch. Gilbert was sitting next to her, eating the rest of the food he had gotten from Rosie, while waiting for the necromancer to wake up. He had already harvested the ogre's nails and teeth, as they could be sold off to alchemists for a bit of extra gold. He noticed that Anastasia opened her eyes and put aside his lunch. "Did you have a good nap?" he asked and pointed up to make the necromancer look there as well. "If I were you, I wouldn't look down at your clothes. I tried wiping some of it off, but that dress is a goner." Anastasia looked anyway and immediately threw up over the side of the porch. Gilbert laughed. The farmer said you could have one of his lay wife's dresses for the trouble, since this didn't go exactly like the notice said. The old farmer was piling up branches and small logs on top of the ogre's corpse that was still lying in front of the house, and trying to move its limbs a bit. For a man of his age, he was a really hard worker. What is he doing with the body? We don't have to clean up as well, do we? Anastasia worried and looked back up before she would have to throw up again. Nay, he said he'll burn it and use the ashes as fertilizer. No idea if that makes sense or not, but at least it won't be left to rot and attract wolves or anything. Gilbert shrugged. The dress is on the chair over there. Anastasia was relieved that she wouldn't have to get rid of the body. She would have not made it through chopping it apart into more movable pieces. It would have been possible for her to reanimate it with necromancy to just walk it back into the forest, but she had a strict policy against doing such things. Dead things should stay dead after all. Though still feeling a little wobbly, she really wanted to get out of the bloody clothes, and somehow managed to get up and go inside to change into the old dress. It more or less fit her, but had a horrid-looking flower pattern on it. Most people would have probably stuck with the blood-stained ones instead, but sadly that wasn't an option for Anastasia. She stepped back out and could hear Gilbert failing to hold back laughter. "Oh, shut up, or I'll throw up on you. I'm sure he has a dress for you too," Anastasia threatened him. The farmer had finished building the pyre and walked over. "Well, would you look at that? You remind me of the good old days with Edna," he said and winked at Anastasia. Yeah. Thanks for the dress, it's not covered in blood." Anastasia struggled to compliment her new attire. "Can you burn these too? I don't think the blood is going to come off," she asked and offered her old clothes to the farmer. The farmer nodded. "Just toss them into the pile," he said and nodded towards the pyre. "Now I do believe I owe you folks a bit of coin for your bravery. That was a might fine scuffle," he continued and handed Gilbert a pouch of coins. "I put in a bit of extra for the ogre. I really had no idea there was something like that out there." Gilbert quickly checked the insides of the pouch, not because he didn't trust the man, but because it was something a smart adventurer got into a habit of doing. There were cases of people paying with counterfeit coins and moving away before the guild returned to ask for the money. Usually the guild would hire adventurers that excelled in tracking to do it, but even then, there was no guarantee that the person would be able to actually pay. So knowing the basics about identifying counterfeit currency was something that seems to be all here. "Pleasure doing business with you, sir," he said and shook the farmer's hand before turning towards the road leading back to Valor. "Anna, thank the man, so we can go." Anastasia thanked the man for the dress and tossed her old one into the pile of branches, leaves and ogre, before hurrying to catch up with Gilbert. Though a bit late in their schedule, the pair was still well on track to get back to the inn, while dinner was still available. While walking, they went over the fight with the ogre, and how it could have gone horribly wrong very easily. Usually forest ogres are not something two adventurers go against. Normally it would take 5 or 3 skilled ones with a good plan to take one down relatively safely. In most cases, arrows and swords had no success against the creature's thick height and fat, so the parties had a mage to deal the final blow, after the others had tired the ogre out. Poisons were also moderately effective, but it required multiple hits with arrows in places where its skin was easier to pierce, and so was very risky. The wound on Gilbert's arm wasn't anything serious, but it still grossed out the necromancer. "Aren't you going to patch that up?" she asked and pointed at the gash. The adventurer took a look at his forearm. "Nay, it's not that bad, and I didn't think we'd need gauze today, so I didn't pack any," he shrugged. Anastasia frowned, tore off a sleeve from her dress and tied it over the wound. "It was making me feel sick," she said and gagged just from thinking about it too much. Gilbert laughed. "Ah, well, now you've gone and ruined the guy's dress." "It was ruined while it was being made. At least now it did some good in the world," Anastasia said. With the wound dealt with, they returned to their conversation. Both of them knew that they had just gotten extremely lucky, since there was a whole host of ways it could have gone very wrong. If Gilbert had failed to hold it still long enough, it would have no doubt worn him out eventually, and there was nothing Anastasia could have done alone. Both of them agreed that they really need at least one more person in their party. "How much gold are the ingredients going to get us?" Anastasia asked to change the subject to something a bit more cheerful. Gilbert calculated the price with his fingers. Should be at least 3,000 or so. They're pretty rare, but not in great shape. Together with the rewards, we'll both get a decent chunk of money, though it's still a joke for downing a forest ogre," he said. For the rest of the walk, Anastasia listed different things she wanted to buy eventually, and Gilbert tallied up their costs as a goal for the fresh adventure. Before they even realized, they were already back at the gates of Valor. They walked past the woman lying on the bench without looking at her, because she was clearly awake now and suffering from what was probably a hangover of the century. Unfortunately for the pair, the woman noticed them and stumbled up from the bench, kicking over a couple of the bottles at her feet. "Ah, the tiny necromancer. I've been looking for you." She greeted Anastasia cheerily while pulling her pure white cloak back on. Under she was wearing almost a full set of plate armor, which was also spotless and without a flaw or dent. Her curly fire-red hair was also miraculously untangled, and her slightly tanned face bright and clean, to a point that the only way Anastasia knew that she was still drunk was her unstable stumbling and a noticeable odor of wine. Anastasia didn't want anything to do with her, so she barely turned to look at the woman when speaking. "Why? I have no business with your kind," she scoffed. "Don't be like that. I never did anything to you or your friends, did I?" The armored woman insisted on talking to her. Going over the incident at the inn, Anastasia realized that what the woman said was true. She had not spoken a word nor done anything. It seemed more like she was just being dragged along. Gilbert still had his suspicions. "Where's your asshole friend?" he asked. The woman laughed. "Alex is in the jail until he starts to behave. Knowing him, it'll take years at least. Besides, he's not a friend, he simply tagged along to protect me because he heard there was money to be made here in Valor. I'm just going to leave him there. Honestly, I've wanted to get rid of him since day one, but he just didn't seem to die, no matter how many bandit camps I steered him into." "Is that so?" Gilbert muttered and rubbed his chin. The woman turned back to Anastasia. "Oh, I should introduce myself." She realized and bowed to the necromancer. "I am Emilia, an ex-priestess of Sylvia, currently only a devotee of her, unrelated to the Church of Dipshits. As a sign of goodwill, may I heal the wound on your friend's arm? I'd heal your sense of style, but that's beyond my means." She laughed and grabbed Gilbert's arm before even getting a permission to do so. She tried to grab something that should have been hanging from her belt but wasn't there. After a bit of looking around, she pulled an ornate one-handed mace from behind the bench and wiped some dirt off it before giving it a quick kiss. The mace began to glow slightly as Emilia began her prayer and placed it on Gilbert's wound. As the wound grew shut before their eyes, Gilbert felt a burning sensation on his arm that wasn't quite pain but not pleasant either. "That should do it," Emilia happily said and hung the mace from her belt. "So how about we grab a drink and talk business?" she suggested and ushered the pair of adventurers through the gates. Gilbert had to visit the guild office to register the quest as completed and pay the tax from the reward. Since it was supposed to be a simple quest, the whole party wasn't needed for it. He was fine leaving Anastasia alone with Emilia since they were in the city, but did tell her to go straight to the inn. Some of the guests in the tavern recognized Emilia from the incident and seemed surprised to see her back inside, together with Anastasia too. When the necromancer and devotee sat down at a corner table to wait for Gilbert, someone told Rosie about the situation, and she came out of the kitchen to see what was up. "Why's this trumpet of Sylvia with you? Where's Gil?" the innkeeper asked and glared at Emilia. Anastasia opened her mouth to answer, but Emilia beat her to it and stood up. "Your name calling hurts me, Miss Tigress. I make no excuses for my ex-companion's rudeness, but I for one find both you and your inn very charming. But enough about that, I am here to make an offer to your tiny friend here," she declared and pointed at the necromancer. Rosie frowned. "You talk too much. I asked Anna, not you. Say another word and I'll toss you out," she threatened and turned to Anastasia. "Honestly, I have no idea. She said she had an offer and we figured she hasn't actually done anything to us, so why not just hear her out?" Anastasia shrugged. Rosie didn't respond and instead just disappeared into the kitchen to get a plate with an assortment of sausages, cheese, crackers and grapes on it, and placed it on the table considerably closer to Anastasia than Emilia. "How was your first quest?" the tigress asked, intending to ignore the devotee of Sylvia until Gilbert returned. And what the shit are you wearing? Did you turn into someone's grandma out there? The deer were all dead. There was a forest ogre, so we killed it. I got blood on me and threw up, so I had to change my dress. Anastasia listed while shoving the snacks in her mouth like there was no tomorrow. Got the money though. You and Gil killed an ogre. Just the two of you. Are you okay? Rosie worried and took Anastasia's hand. Yup, we got kind of lucky. Hopefully we'll find one or two more people before the next one. Anastasia nodded and continued to gobble the snacks with her free hand. Hearing that made Amelia extremely excited and she clapped her hands together to interrupt the conversation. This is better than I could have hoped for. With Alex in jail, I could use a couple of companions that aren't shitty racist twats. You and that big fellow certainly seem like you could use someone watching your backs and keeping you intact. So this is what I suggest. Let's form a party. She said and pointed at Anastasia. Rosie wasn't too keen on the strange woman, so she was immediately skeptical of the suggestion. Even though Amelia certainly seemed like she could handle herself, she wasn't exactly high up on the list of people the tigress would trust her friends' lives with. And what exactly do you bring to the table? Aside from the smell of cheap wine? She asked and snarled at the devotee. I bring with me the blessings of my lady Sylvia, of course. Amelia declared and hoisted her mace towards the ceiling. Also, I'm adept at hitting things with this in my fist. Anastasia thought about Gilbert getting hurt during the fight with the ogre. There was nothing she could do to protect him in any way. In fact, if there was more than one foe, she would be the one who needed protecting since she had zero experience fighting hand to hand. A second capable pair of fists would go a long way to give the party some freedom. I hate to say this, but she does have a point. Anastasia admitted and grabbed the last sausage from the plate. Chapter 8. The morning was colder than usual for the season, and a thick mist filled the streets of Valor and the fields around it. Though technically not working in the inn anymore, Anastasia felt like she owed Rosie something, and had gotten up early to help the innkeeper with the breakfast preparations. Rosie had told her that she could wait until the next quest before she needed to start paying for the room, so Anastasia could spend her cut of yesterday's reward on some clothes and gear. Though the shops were probably already open, she didn't feel like going outside until the mist cleared and chose to stay in the warm kitchen for a while longer. Still feeling like you can overcome your fear of blood? Rosie asked and handed the necromancer a cup of coffee. Anastasia savored the first sip for a while before answering. I'm not afraid of it, blood is just really disgusting. I think it'll just take a while to figure it out, though I'm still going to use necromancy out there. It's way too useful to just ignore it. The innkeeper gave her a pat on the head. You should still learn how to use a dagger and a bow properly, just enough to at least defend yourself from a sudden attack. Max is probably the person who can help you with it the most. Anastasia remembered seeing a pair of daggers on the elf's hips, and peeked into the tavern to see if he was up yet, but wasn't able to see any member of the trio. Those three left on a quest yesterday. It's by the coast, so it'll take a couple of days at least. Rosie said and tossed some more firewood into the stove. Something about giant crabs, I think. The necromancer sighed and returned to her seat. She couldn't wait for a proper quest of her own. Something that was actually supposed to be slightly more intense and not just take a turn for the worse. After Gilbert had returned last night, they had agreed that the assets Amelia would bring with her, overweight or annoying drunken behavior, so she had been accepted into the party. With the three of them, they should be able to take on some intermediate quests without too much trouble. But first, Anastasia needed some gear, something slightly more protective than a plain dress. Even if she wasn't supposed to be the one to get in harm's way, something light that could protect her from a stray cut would go a long way. Where can I get something that looks cool and ideally isn't black? There's a small leather workshop on the main street, only a few buildings from the market. You could get a leather vest, better boots that don't ruin your feet when you need to walk for a few days in a row, a belt that has enough pouches for a few odds and ends and some proper gloves, and a cloak. You should have one before you need to sleep outside when it's cold for the first time. Rosie listed and peeked into the tavern to see if it was filling up yet. I'm still a bit hazy on the whole money thing, but I think I can get most of that, Anastasia said while jingling her purse. Her first priority was still getting some regular clothes, as she didn't have that many to begin with, and had already lost some after arriving to Valor. After finishing her coffee as well as a refill, Anastasia deemed that it was warm enough outside, and she should just get the shopping out of the way. She placed her cup into the washing basin and excused herself. "If you're on your way out, could you also toss that drunkard out of my inn? She has to rent a room if she wants to sleep here," Rosie asked and waved to the necromancer. Emilia was lying down in the corner of the tavern, surrounded by a new set of wine bottles. Though at first glance she looked fine, when she got up to greet Anastasia and emptied one of the bottles next to her, the necromancer started to wonder whether letting the devotee into the party was such a great idea. "Get up, Rosie says you need to rent a room or leave," Anastasia said coldly and started arranging the empty bottles on a table. How cold of her. But fine, even though the service here leaves something to be desired, I shall rent a room here as soon as I balance my finances," the drunken devotee declared and started to look around for something. "Have you seen my mace? Rosie took it last night, after you tried to heal her attitude. We can get it back later," Anastasia said and felt bad watching Emilia fight the vertigo as she stumbled up. "I know I'm going to regret this, but do you want to go shopping for gear with me?" Emilia looked delighted to hear that. "Why, of course, tiny necromancer. I know quite a bit about quality armor after all," she exclaimed and forcibly "Can you not call me that? Just say Anna or Anastasia." The necromancer sighed and pushed off Emilia, worried that the stench of alcohol would catch on her clothes. Emilia grabbed a bottle that still had some wine in it from the floor, and escorted the necromancer outside. On the way to the workshop, she bombarded Anastasia with annoying questions, almost like she was trying to forcibly befriend the necromancer, all the while sipping from the bottle every now and then. "Why are you here? I mean in Valor. Is the church trying to spread here?" Anastasia asked, tired of answering the devotee's questions. The perpetual smile on Emilia's face died down. "I have nothing to do with the church anymore, trust me. Those lying heretics have left the light of my Lady Sylvia long ago, and now just keep up the act for money and power. Leaving that wretched place allows me to better serve Lady Sylvia," she explained in a sudden, serious tone. "I chose you because I need a competent party to get on the guild's good side, and maybe one day get the permission for a small temple of my own. One that's based on joy and helping one another, instead of horrible bigotry and greed." Anastasia was surprised by the serious answer, enough for it to improve her opinion of Emilia slightly. She may have been an annoying drunk, but her motives seemed honest and good, not that they would help her, when the guards see her walking around with a wine bottle so early in the morning. "And why all the wine? You know that small little voice in your head that tells you what's right or wrong? Well, the voice in my head isn't mine." Emilia sighed, looked at the sky and emptied her bottle. "The wine silenced it for a while, now it just makes it easier to handle until I figure out what's true and what isn't." Their new party member, hearing voices in her head, undid some of the work her earlier answer had done, and didn't exactly instill confidence in the drunken devotee. "Of course, I can stop if it's a problem during quests, I think." Emilia shrugged. Their awkward conversation ended when Anastasia noticed the shop Rosie had talked about. It was a rather small establishment in the corner of a building. Above the door was a sign that read "Green Hide," and the windows had a few sets of leather armor on display. Emilia pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. "Orcish leatherwork, huh? It's not a bad choice for a low budget. They make their leather simple and sturdy, so don't expect much in the way of intricate patterns or extra features," she explained and headed inside with Anastasia. Inside the shop was a small counter with a gruff-looking older orc behind it, working on something. The shopkeeper took one look at Anastasia and returned to his work. "Sorry, child, but I don't make dresses or the like," he mumbled. "That's all right, I'm here for something that might actually have a chance to save my life," Anastasia said and looked at the armor on display. The orc seemed surprised and stopped working. "Really now? I had you pegged as a child, but if it's armor you're looking for, you've come to the right place. I have a decent selection of everything pint size, so what can I get you?" "I need a vest, boots, gloves and a belt," the necromancer listed. It didn't take long for the orc to find the items among the gear on the shelves of the shop. Every now and then he glanced at Anastasia to make sure he had the right size and shape picked. He carefully placed them on the counter in front of the girl and gestured for her to take a look. "You're a bit lanky, so you can't wear things meant for dwarven folk, so instead I think the sizes meant for childlings should go well for you," he explained while Anastasia wiggled the vest on. "It has some steel plating on the shoulders and the collar, not really what people who are expecting to get hit would wear, but it'll stop your average blade or a set of teeth." At first Anastasia had thought that the vest was heavy to carry, but once she had it on, the weight disappeared, and she was able to move around freely. Just like Emilia had said, it was plain looking, but felt like it could take a beating, and above all else, it fit perfectly. There's a few dyed versions left if the regular leather color isn't what you're looking for. Personally, I think black would match well with your fair complexion, the shopkeeper said and returned to the shelf he had taken the vest from. "Actually, I was thinking," Anastasia said, but was interrupted by the devotee. "I agree. Black is definitely her color, and it goes well with basically anything you might wear under it," Emilia said excitedly. Not feeling like fighting the two about it, Anastasia accepted her fate as a necromancer in ever so stereotypical black attire. "Fine, I'll take it in black. Can I try the other stuff?" she sighed. The orc made sure the boots were shiny when he handed them to Anastasia, along with the belt and gloves. Everything fit her perfectly, though they had to punch an extra hole into the belt so it didn't fall off. Anastasia walked around for a bit and kicked the air a few times to make sure the boots would stay on. Though it wasn't much, having some armor made her feel like an actual adventurer, so she decided to take the entire set, though regrettably in all black. The total cost for them was around 2,000 gold, which the necromancer could have afforded, but Emilia somehow managed to negotiate the price down by 200. With the remaining money, they were able to buy some basic clothing from one of the stands in the market on their way back to the inn, just so Anastasia could finally toss out her old Mernvalian clothing and fit into Valor properly. As they were browsing the selection on some of the other stands, they ran into Gilbert, who had been sent out of the inn on some errands by Rosie. "If you got all the gear you need, we could just go and get us a new quest," the old adventurer suggested. Anastasia perked up. "What? Right now? An actual quest and not something boring?" she asked and grabbed Gilbert's sleeve. Gilbert laughed. When I went by the guild office last night, there was a quest that caught my eye. Something about a village being attacked by an unknown creature, 3 people dead so far." The necromancer's eyes shined more than ever as she rushed through the crowd to get to the office before the quest would get taken by someone else. Luckily the notice was still up on the wall when she made it there. She had to jump to reach it, but managed to pluck it from the wall before Gilbert and Emilia caught up with her. While waiting in line to get to the counter, Anastasia swayed back and forth, unable to stay still for a second. "Are you here to accept a quest?" The eerily familiar looking, yet slightly different than the previous clerk asked when the party finally reached the front of the line. Anastasia slammed the notice on the counter in excitement and grinned. "Yes. We'd like this one," she declared grandly and pushed the notice through the slot into the glass panel separating the clerk from the adventurers. "I see," the crystal-horned official said and glared at Gilbert, clearly suggesting that he needed to calm the necromancer. "The village of Angarist has been under attack, and the local governor has asked for the guild's aid. The reward you receive will be based on your level of success. 10,000 for identifying and locating the threat and additional 30,000 for stopping the attacks." She recounted the information on the notice. "Please identify yourself," the clerk said and pointed at a pearl stand on the counter while sliding a small glass card into a slit on her side of it. Each of the adventurers popped in their glass pearls and waited for them to flash orange and dim back down again. Once the whole party was done, the clerk took out the glass card and placed it into a drawer behind her that was already full of them. "First quest as a party. The guild wishes you luck and expects nothing but success," the official stated monotonously and bowed. "Be safe and get out of the line to let the next party to the counter." Chapter 9. Angarist was a small village surrounded by fields of wheat on one side and a dark, swampy forest on the other. The residents mostly kept to themselves and only sent out a merchant to sell their handmade goods in bigger cities a few times a year. They were wealthy by no measure, and hardly would have spent the coin on hiring adventurers themselves, so the quest must have been commissioned by the local lord or someone else higher up the chain of command. It fell perfectly in the guild's market niche. Sure, the Lord could have taken a portion of his army, equipped them with all the gear needed to travel to Angarist, stay there for a bit and travel back, with the risk of them not finding anything or even getting killed themselves, whereas hiring a few adventurers that had their own gear and traveling methods was far cheaper in comparison. And if they failed, it didn't cost the Lord anything. In a town of maybe 30 people, the deaths of 3 was certainly a cause for alarm. Whatever was going on may have been just the beginning after all. Gilbert hopped off the merchant wagon the party had gotten a ride from in exchange for protection, of course. He could immediately pick up on the worried mood of the village. Barely anyone was staying outside, and whenever they had to leave the safety of their homes, they would run. Almost all windows had been covered or at least had their curtains closed, but every now and then someone would open them slightly to peek at the adventurers. Emilia was in a horrible mood. Gilbert had forbidden alcohol during quests for obvious reasons, but the devotee felt like being sober would only hinder her effectiveness. She couldn't wait for the quest to be over, so she could return to the inn as a resident and a paying customer. Whatever is killing all the people here, come out so I can kill you and get this over and done with. She yelled, much to the dismay of the villagers, and causing even the braver ones to hurry inside and lock their doors. After scolding her, Gilbert went around knocking on doors until he finally found the unofficial leader of the village, hoping to get some information about the attacks from him. Though even he tried to close the door on the adventurers, but Gilbert managed to get his foot in first. Can you tell us anything about the attacks? Even the smallest detail might be helpful. He asked and pulled the door open. The old man inside retreated to a window and peeked between the curtains at the forest right outside the village. He gestured for the adventurers to come in and hastily locked the door after them. Look, I can't help you, no one saw nothing, he said and kept staring through the window. So these were 3 separate attacks, with no witnesses, Gilbert suggested. When you found the bodies, was there anything weird about them? Like stolen belongings or parts or anything? Throats slit, all 3 of them, but not a drop of blood on their clothes. Some were thinking it's vampires, but the last one got done in at noon. Poor Robert was supposed to marry our Isabel. The man recounted and nervously fiddled with his axe that was placed next to the window. Gilbert scratched his gray beard. So it doesn't avoid daylight, doesn't take anything from the victims, probably drinks their blood. I can think of a dozen or so creatures that do this sort of thing, he muttered. A dozen? That's way too many, Anastasia interrupted. You're saying that there are over 10 types of things that kill people in this extremely specific way. The world is a vast and dangerous place, there's room for all kinds of things. It's why we stay in business too. The old adventurer shrugged before turning to their host again. It's probably something like swamp fairies, though they would take some teeth from their victims to make necklaces with, but you might have scared them away before they managed to do that. I've seen it happen before. Either way, it's pretty obvious that whatever it is, it's coming from the swamps. We'll set up a camp a few hundred meters that way and survey the area. You and your people should probably stay inside like you have, he explained and gave the old man a reassuring pat on the shoulder before guiding his party back outside. Okay, so no, we just go check out the woods like we did the last time, and beat up whatever we find? Anastasia asked excitedly. She was unable to contain her mood any longer and pranced towards the dark forest. But even Anastasia's mood didn't last long in the humid forest, where every tree root seemed like it was purposefully put there to be in the way, and a single wrong step could have resulted in a quick swim in one of the many pools of foul-smelling water. When the search reached its 5th hour without even a faintest of clues about the whereabouts of whatever was lurking in the swamps, all 3 adventurers agreed that it was just better to make a camp on a suitable clearing near the edge of the forest, and hope that the creature in question would come and find them instead. As the sun set, the party gathered whatever firewood they were able to find and started a campfire. The whole quest was nothing new to Gilbert, and he wasn't too bothered by the annoying terrain or the unsuccessful search. Emilia had spent most of the search relatively still because her head was killing her, and every movement was pure agony. Anastasia was simply extremely bored. She had imagined that they would find the culprit within minutes, and return to the village victorious. Now that we've gotten a better look at the area, I think we're against a Vurin, Gilbert said to start a conversation. The swamps suit them just fine, and they rarely leave traces. But what now? How big is it? Anastasia perked up. Not too big, about the size of a small chubby child. That doesn't mean they're not dangerous. Many of the world's most vicious things come in small packages. Take you for an example. The old adventurer explained and pointed at the necromancer with his pipe. The problem with Vuren is their telepathic capabilities. Visions, nightmares, imaginary sounds, everything is fair game for them, so keep your mind steeled. Usually they target lone travelers, so it might not attack all of us at once, but this one is clearly a bit braver than your average Vuren, since it's going against an entire village. He continued and poured himself some coffee they had prepared on the fire. Basically, what we're looking for is something that looks like a mix between a pig and a bat, about a meter high, brown fur, razor-sharp claws. Okay, so how do we kill it? Emilia pitched in. Conventional methods work fine, just need a clean blow at it, and it'll go down. Just need to lure it to attack us, Gilbert said. Emilia did her best to shake off her hangover, and poured herself a cup of coffee, as well as refilled Anastasia's cup. I think I know what to do. One of us pretends to leave the camp alone, while the other two follow close behind quietly. Personally, I vote that beefcake over here goes first, she whispered. Gilbert waited for a while, hoping for better ideas to pop up, but none did. He sighed and got up. Fair enough, my throat is covered by armor anyway, so I won't be in any immediate danger. Just make sure you don't lose me, or each other. He stretched his back and legs before wandering into the darkness surrounding the camp. When he was barely visible, Emilia and Anastasia stealthily snuck after him. For such an old and sizable man, Gilbert was surprisingly nimble in his movements, and proved to be more difficult to follow than Emilia had assumed, so much so that they needed to risk being seen just to catch up. After about 2 hours of tailing, Emilia and Anastasia were starting to get exhausted, and began considering just giving up and coming up with a new plan. Maybe the Vuren just wasn't dumb enough to fall into such a simple trap. Suddenly, out of the corner of her eye, Anastasia spotted a hooded figure in the darkness and halted. The putrid stench of her home country immediately flooded over her when her eyes locked with the mysterious figure. In her mind it could only mean one thing. Morn Valley had found her. Anastasia, it's time to come back home. Become the monster you were supposed to be, the other necromancer demanded. Come with me now or face consequences. Anastasia looked around to see if the necromancer had brought reinforcements along, but wasn't able to spot any. She did, however, notice that she had lost both Emilia and Gilbert. Worried that the possible other necromancers had gotten them already, she lashed out at the shadowy figure. Fuck all of you, I have a new life now, and I will kill every single one of you, if that's what it takes for you to leave me be. When the figure darted into the darkness, Anastasia dashed after it without giving it a second of thought. She had to stop the other necromancer before they could tell others about her whereabouts, or worse yet, harm her new friends. Meanwhile, Emilia had just noticed that Anastasia was gone. She could have sworn that the small necromancer was right behind her just a few seconds ago, but was now nowhere to be seen. The devotee could still see Gilbert in the distance, but something seemed off with him, too. His pace had slowed down quite a bit, and Emilia could hear him speak to someone but couldn't see anyone else. Shouting his name didn't seem to catch his attention either. Oh, Emilia. What have you become? A pathetic drunk who can't even protect her party. Not much of a priestess, are you? A sudden familiar voice said. Emilia turned around to see Alex, the paladin she had left the church with, step out from the darkness. Do you still hear the voices? Has your booze-rotten brain gotten to a point where you can't even tell if you're hallucinating, or if this goddess of yours is actually talking to you? I figured that it was just another sad lie to try and get some attention, but I didn't realize it was so bad that you continued telling stories even after we parted ways. The paladin cackled and walked around Emilia. Well then, chosen of Sylvia, or whatever you called yourself, how about we just get back to the church, and maybe they'll let you clean the floors in exchange for wine. The devotee stared at her previous companion in silence, before suddenly giggling slightly. I see, so that's how it is, she muttered. Yesterday this might have worked on me, but today I'm unfortunately sober, yet Sylvia still sings to me. She grasped her mace and pointed it towards the night sky. My lady, clear the clouded minds of my companions, so that they won't get wasted on the swamp. Let them hear the true beauty of your songs, and see the blazing glory of the goddess of joy. She prayed with a grand tone in her voice. The mace began to glow brightly before bursting on fire and causing a shockwave of heat that dispelled the Vuren's illusions in a blink of an eye. With its ruse discovered, the ugly creature showed itself and leaped towards Amelia's back in a final attempt to kill its prey, but unfortunately for the Vuren, Emilia had heard it and turned around just in time to smash the creature's skull with a powerful strike of her mace, killing it instantly. Anastasia had lost the necromancer she had chased and was frantically looking around when she felt a sudden wave of pressure and warmth emanating from a bright light in the distance. It took a few seconds for her to put the pieces together on what had happened, but when she realized that the Vuren had successfully tricked her into separating from Emilia, she sprinted towards the light as fast as she could, in case it was the devotee signaling for help. While running, Anastasia realized that she heard a second set of steps behind her. Not daring to look back as that would almost certainly make her trip on something, she began screaming and hoped it would get Emilia's attention. It worked out surprisingly well and gave Emilia a few seconds to come up with something after she saw her necromancer friend and the beast chasing her. "Anna, roll," she yelled and pointed at a spot on the ground in front of her. Anastasia did her best, but her roll turned into a stumble and a face plant into the moss. It did, however, achieve what the priestess had hoped, and the Vuren chasing Anastasia jumped over the necromancer, right into Emilia's armored fist. The creature's face made a horrible crunching noise as it came to a sudden stop. To seal the deal, the devotee stomped on the twitching beast's neck and broke it. Without taking a second to catch her breath, Emilia pulled Anastasia back on her feet and dashed into the direction where Gilbert had been in, only to find the old adventurer already heading their way while carrying a dead Vuren. "Nice work with the light. I could have sworn I was heading back to the camp with you guys, but that's exactly how these bastards work. Are both of you all right?" he said and tossed the Vuren into a nearby bush. Before Emilia could answer, Anastasia raced past her and bumped into Gilbert at full speed. Gil, you should have been there," she exclaimed and started going through the events in a way that was somehow both excessively detailed and incoherent for the most part. Gilbert rubbed his beard. "Can't say that I've heard three of them working together before," he said and patted the necromancer's head to make her calm down and shut up. "Well, judging by how we're no longer being attacked, this was either all of them or we scared away the rest, probably for good, so how about we go back to the village and share the good news? And get paid, of course." The townsfolk were beyond thankful for killing the beasts and bringing an end to the uncertainty. They would have held a small celebration, but Gilbert figured it was a bit too late for that, and disappeared into one of the houses with a young foxfolk seamstress, who seemed particularly impressed by the adventurer's deeds. Anastasia fell asleep as soon as she had to be still for more than 10 seconds, and was dragged into one of the houses that belonged to someone who had been killed by the Vuren. Emilia sat down next to the sleeping necromancer and inspected a bottle of wine she had spotted in one of the kitchen cabinets, while looking for anything to drink. She moved the bottle around and peered through it in candlelight. "Well, technically the quest is now over, right?" She laughed and kept staring at the bottle. Chapter 10. Having returned to Valor on a merchant's carriage, the party celebrated their first quest together. Anastasia felt slightly bad about ditching her job as a waitress so quickly, so she helped with the preparation of the celebratory feast, while Gilbert stayed behind in the guild office to deal with the taxes, and Emilia checked out the room on the second floor of the inn she could finally afford to rent. By the time everything was ready, the whole party had returned to the tavern, happily dug into their plates when Anastasia and Rosie laid them out. As they ate, Anastasia recounted what happened during the quest to Rosie, and hearing that Emilia had actually proven useful by saving the entire party, improved her opinion of the drunkard very slightly. "You know, if you toned down the drinking a bit, you'd almost be pleasant to have around," the innkeeper said and flicked Emilia's forehead. "Oh, does the mean Miss Tigress like me now?" The priestess laughed and leaned towards Rosie. "Truly, I'm honored. Don't make me change my mind again," Rosie snarled. The drunken priestess had lost a considerable portion of her survival instincts, and decided that it was a good idea to hug the innkeeper. Normally it would have meant a swift flight through the inn's door for almost anyone, but for some reason Rosie almost felt bad for Emilia, and simply pushed her chair over. They were interrupted by the door creaking open and Zamiliere walking in with a massive crab leg triumphantly held above her head. "Cry-ya-ya," the Spriggan declared and threw the leg on the floor. For whatever reason, this warranted a round of applause from the adventurers in the tavern, though no one was sure why exactly. Soon after the Spriggan, the rest of her party entered, holding 2 equally massive crab feet each. They hauled them to the kitchen and negotiated a deal with Rosie about cooking them for everyone in the tavern, which didn't take too much convincing as the innkeeper herself loved some crab meat and garlic butter. Anastasia was awed by the size of the legs. "How did you even kill something this big?" she asked and tried to lift one of them. Dammer laughed. "We killed 14 of the buggers. At first, we had some trouble getting through the hard shell, but then borrowed a cannon from one of the nearby ships, and then it was just a matter of Sammy just tying them down with roots, and us shoving the cannon in their mouth. It was a blast," he explained and seemed proud of his pun. "Aw man. That just makes our quest seem boring." Now the necromancer frowned. The dwarf seemed surprised. "You lot were on a quest. Let's grab a drink and tell this old dwarf the full story. New adventurers going out is always hilarious." He laughed and patted Anastasia on the back. Stories were exchanged, and the celebration continued late into the night. At some point, Holly the night waitress appeared into the tavern and seemed confused by the unusually loud start for her shift, but gladly accepted the crab meat given to her. As the night progressed, the celebrations died down. Anastasia fell asleep at the table and had to be carried to her room. Emilia passed out under a table after drinking too much, and had to be dragged to her room by Rosie, while Zamiliere left for a walk in the fields around Valor to recharge herself. Gilbert, Maximilian and Dammer were left in silence to smoke their pipes, until the morning sun started to peek over the city walls again. The sun was already at its highest when it woke up the young necromancer. While still a bit groggy, she dug out some of her new clothes from her wardrobe. Trying to figure out a matching pair of socks proved to be too much of a hurdle so soon after waking up, so Anastasia headed to the baths with 1 white and 1 light blue sock. The warm bath did wonders for waking her up, and gave her a chance to think about what she would do with her share of the reward money while soaking. The old rusty dagger she had taken from Morn Valley had briefly caught her eye while she had combed through her wardrobe. It was dull to the point of uselessness, and Anastasia hadn't even bothered to take it with her on either of her quests, so getting a usable one would definitely be a good use for the money, and hopefully within her price range. After begrudgingly leaving the warm bath, Anastasia ran into Emilia in the corridor. The priestess seemed to be deep in thought while staring at the door to the innkeeper's room. "Do you need Rosie for something?" the necromancer asked after sneaking up on her friend. "She has probably been in the kitchen for hours by now." Obviously startled by the question, Emilia flinched and took a second to gather herself again. "Oh. I mean Anna. Good morning to you. Did you sleep well?" Anastasia noticed immediately that something was off about the priestess. She seemed somehow unusually hesitant and sober. The necromancer squinted and glared at her before sniffing a couple of times. "You smell weird. Are you actually not drunk right now?" I did some thinking, and I'm going to try and not drink anymore," Emilia said and smiled awkwardly. "Let's just get some breakfast, okay?" They had missed the brunt of the lunch rush and had no trouble finding an empty table. Anastasia could see Emilia glancing at the bottles on the nearby tables, and eventually the priestess got so frustrated that she pulled her hood up. On top of that, Emilia kept staring at the table every time Rosie stepped out of the kitchen. Rosie brought out their meals with some leftover crab meat. She was amused by how obviously the priestess was trying to avoid looking at her, and pulled down her hood to mess with her. "What, did a cat get your tongue?" the innkeeper asked and laughed. Emilia just pulled her hood back up and quietly thanked her for the food. "Do you know where Max is?" "I need to know where I can get a dagger," Anastasia interrupted them. "He was still up when I woke up, so probably still upstairs," the innkeeper shrugged. "But I know that he buys his weapons from the dwarven blacksmith on the other side of the market. In fact, most of the folk here do." "Nice. I'll head there once I've figured out how to eat this cooked rock," the necromancer said and held up a boiled egg that had been served with her spinach soup. Rosie sighed and shook her head. "As much as I'd like so see how this goes, I have a kitchen to run." she said, collected some dishes from other tables and disappeared back into the kitchen. While rolling around the egg and considering just biting into it, Anastasia kept an eye on Amelia and her weirdly silent behavior. Every time Rosie brought out some plates, she'd pull on the hood of her pure white robes and hid her face more. "I know how you feel," the necromancer said, and tested the eggshell with her teeth. "Rosie seems really scary at first, but she's actually the nicest person here. You don't need to be afraid of her." "What? Oh, right. Hey, you know her well, or at least better than I do. Do you think she hates me?" The priestess whispered and took the egg from Anastasia before she had the chance to bite it. "Nah. You'd know for sure if she did." Anastasia pointed out and watched in awe as the priestess peeled the egg and sliced it up into the soup. "She's straightforward like that. You'd be out of here already if she actually hated your guts." That made Amelia feel visibly better, but not enough for her to pull the hood back down. They enjoyed their meals while chatting about daggers and the priestess's new conviction. She had figured that as she was going to help Anastasia and Gilbert, she had to use her gifts to their fullest, even if it meant listening to the voice of a goddess in her head all the time. Not that she would ever even consider denying Sylvia, but it was simply a lot to deal with. When the time came for Anastasia to leave, she asked Amelia to tag along, but the priestess chose to stay behind and, according to herself, try to figure out what to use her share of the reward on. The blacksmith shop was visible from the inn, though only barely, thanks to the merchant stalls filling the market square. On the way to the other side, Anastasia stopped by a couple of them that had some weaponry on sale, but nothing caught her eye. The blacksmith's forge was outside of the shop itself, and she could see a dwarf banging away on a piece of metal next to it. Compared to Dammer, the smith was obviously very young and lacked any beard. Anastasia disagreed with the fashion choice, since dwarves should always have beards as far as she was concerned, but figured that it would probably catch fire quite a lot when working at the forge. The dwarf noticed the necromancer staring at him judgingly. "What can I get you, young lady?" he asked and put down his hammer. Anastasia snapped out of her judgmental thoughts. "I was told Maximilian gets his weapons from here, so I came to look at some daggers," she explained. The blacksmith tried to connect the name to a face for a bit before remembering. "That prissy elven wanker. Aye, he comes here every now and then. Let's head inside and I'll show you the best daggers you've seen in the 5 minutes you've been alive," he said and showed Anastasia the way inside through the side door. Inside the shop was probably the biggest collection of weapons Anastasia had ever seen. Every single wall was lined with swords, axes, bows, daggers, maces, flails, spears, halberds and other weapons she didn't even recognize. The dwarf wiped his hands on his apron and pointed at a wall with 30 or so daggers hanging on it, most of them paired with an identical twin. "You the sneaky type or what? You don't look like a fighter," the blacksmith asked and measured Anastasia with his eyes. "A bit lanky for that too, a mage maybe." "Neither, I just need something in case everything else goes wrong, and I need to stab things. I've literally never held a sword, so it's probably safer if I just get something small," Anastasia explained. The dwarf looked at the daggers on the wall while glancing at Anastasia every now and then, until finally picking a pair and handing them over. "Then I think these two would suit you. Even if you only need one, I'll give you a discount on the other one. They don't really sell without a pair, you see." Anastasia weighed the daggers, waved them around and took a better look at the craftsmanship. As far as she could tell, the blades were immaculate and razor sharp, but what interested her more were the hilts. "Say, what's under the leather in the hilts?" she asked to confirm her suspicion. "Troll bone. A good material for hilts, absorbs blows like no other, a bit on the rare side though," the blacksmith explained. "Though so." Anastasia grinned as the daggers floated up from her hands. She spun them around and slashed through the air before shooting both at a training dummy in the corner of the shop. One of the daggers bounced off due to bad alignment, but the other one sank deep into the wooden head of the dummy. "What in the world was that? What sort of devilish mage are you, child?" the dwarf yelled before connecting the dots in his head. "You're that damn necromancer I've heard about, aren't you?" Anastasia shrugged. "Don't worry about it. If I draw you some pictures, would it be possible to carve them into the bone parts?" she asked. "Don't worry about it," she says. The dwarf muttered and pulled the dagger out from the dummy's head. I don't see why it wouldn't be, he said and unwrapped the leather covering the bone hilts. The blacksmith handed the daggers and a piece of charcoal to Anastasia and told her to mark the patterns down. It didn't take long for the competent weaponsmith to chisel out the markings and wrap the hilts in leather again. Anastasia kept a close eye on the dwarf and was impressed by his bone-working skills. Perfect, the necromancer exclaimed and shot them at the dummy again, this time crashing them both all the way through. I'll take them. How much are they? I'll give them to you for 3,500 gold, if you tell me why I carved the patterns, the blacksmith offered. I'm always looking for ways to improve my work and I sense that you might be a returning customer. Anastasia poured some coins from her purse onto the counter, while the dwarf fitted the daggers into their scabbards, and made sure they would be attached to Anastasia's belt. Yeah, I can afford that much, I think. The necromancer counted the coins. The patterns she started but was interrupted by Amelia storming into the shop. Anna, the guards are looking for you at the inn, she exclaimed worryingly. Did you do something? What, again? Anastasia asked, took her new daggers and left her money behind before rushing out of the door. The blacksmith watched them run across the market before taking his portion of the money on the counter and hiding the rest under the counter. Well, she seems like a fun lass, he sighed and returned to his forge. Hi all, thanks for listening. This is the end of this episode. Please let me know what you think down in the comments below. Again, I'd like to say thank you to Knie for allowing me to use the story for this video.